Long before fish filled the reefs, before whales crossed the open blue, before anything with a backbone had crawled onto land, there was only water. And in that water, life was trying something new. The earliest oceans looked nothing like the seas we know today. There were no coral reefs to hide in, no kelp forests, no sandy shallows where small things could slip away from big things. Just open water, stretching endlessly in every direction, and the creatures that lived there had nowhere to go but forward. Scientists who study these ancient seas describe a world without balance. The chemistry shifted unpredictably, temperatures swung without warning, and when predation first appeared, when one creature first began hunting another, there was no established order to absorb the change. Everything responded at once. What emerged from those early waters were animals that seem almost exaggerated to us now. Jaws built for crushing, teeth shaped like blades, bodies armored and heavy in ways that modern oceans rarely demand. The sea was not yet gentle. It had not yet learned the rhythms that would come later, the refuges, the niches, the quiet corners where smaller lives could persist. That would take time, millions of years of time. Tonight, we'll drift back to those unfinished waters. We'll meet the creatures that evolved before the ocean softened, and we'll watch life feel its way through a world that hadn't yet decided on its rules. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time is it there. It's always a joy to see how far these sleepy stories drift across the world. And if these gentle journeys bring you peace, a like or subscribe helps others find their way here too. Now, let your breath slow, let your body settle, and together let's sink gently into the sea before it learned to be kind. The first oceans did not begin as a calm cradle for life. They were restless, unsettled places, shaped by forces that never paused long enough to settle into balance. Heat moved freely through the water, rising from the planet's interior and spilling across shallow seas. Minerals leached continuously from newly formed crust, clouding the water with reactive elements that shifted from region to region. Nothing stayed the same for long. The chemistry of the ocean breathed in slow, uneven pulses, changing not over gentle eras, but over spans short enough to press constantly against anything alive. Life that appeared in these waters did not grow within a stable system that slowly matured around it. It arrived in the middle of motion, in an environment that offered no guarantees and no forgiveness. There were no reefs to soften currents or break waves into quieter pockets, no layered food webs to distribute energy gradually from one form to another. Every organism existed directly inside the ocean's raw mechanics. Nutrients surged and vanished. Oxygen arrived unevenly, blooming in some regions while fading in others. Temperature gradients stretched across the water, sometimes gentle, sometimes abrupt, always present. For early life, survival was not about efficiency or elegance. It was about persistence in the face of constant change. Simpler bodies survived not because they were optimized, but because they could endure instability without breaking apart. Anything fragile, anything dependent on narrow conditions, simply did not last long enough to leave a trace. Chemical instability was not an occasional stress, it was the background condition of existence. Elements that would later become tightly regulated, parts of biological systems, drifted freely in the water, sometimes useful, sometimes destructive. Iron oxidized suddenly, sulfur compounds built up and dissipated. Acidity shifted in slow but relentless swings. Every cell lived directly exposed to its environment, with no buffering layers of ecosystem or structure to soften the extremes. Adaptation happened not toward comfort, but toward tolerance. Life did not move toward balance, because balance did not yet exist. It moved toward anything that allowed it to remain intact from one moment to the next. In such a world, survival favored traits that seem harsh when viewed through a modern lens. Durability mattered more than flexibility. Redundancy mattered more than efficiency. The earliest successful organisms were not finely tuned instruments, but blunt ones. They endured stress by absorbing it, spreading it across simple systems rather than resisting it outright. Damage was common. Recovery mattered more than avoidance. Regeneration, rapid repair, and the ability to function imperfectly became powerful advantages long before grace or specialization entered the picture. Because there were no stable food webs, energy moved directly from the environment into living tissue with very little mediation. When resources appeared, they appeared suddenly. When they disappeared, they left just as quickly. This favored organisms that could take advantage of brief abundance and survive long stretches of scarcity without failing. Growth happened in uneven bursts rather than steady progress. Bodies that could expand quickly when conditions allowed, then persist through long downturns, shaped the early biological landscape. Size, even at this early stage, began to matter, not as dominance, but as storage, resilience, and inertia against change. The ocean itself imposed direction long before evolution had time to refine it. Movement through open water required strength simply to remain in place. Remaining intact required resistance to pressure, to chemistry, to shifting temperature. Life responded not with delicacy, but with robustness. Structures thickened, protective layers formed, metabolic processes leaned toward force rather than finesse. These were not choices made by organisms, but outcomes filtered relentlessly by the environment. Anything that relied on balance perished in a world that had not yet learned how to hold steady. This foundational hostility shaped everything that followed. Long before predators sharpened the sea into something sharper still, the ocean had already demanded extremity as a baseline. Violence did not arrive into a gentle world. It entered a system already shaped by instability, where survival required meeting force with force. The first oceans trained life to endure pressure, volatility, and loss as normal conditions. By the time more complex interactions began to appear, the water had already selected for bodies capable of withstanding a world that never rested. The path toward lethality did not begin with intent or aggression. It began with an ocean that refused to be calm and with life that learned, early on, that surviving meant becoming stronger than the water itself. For a long while after hunting first appeared, the ocean remained dim in more than one sense. Encounters still relied on proximity, on bodies drifting close enough for contact to occur by chance, guided by currents more than intention. Movement mattered, but awareness did not yet reach far. Life reacted rather than anticipated. This kept danger uneven and unpredictable, sometimes deadly, sometimes narrowly missed, often decided by accident as much as ability. But as bodies slowly changed, as sensory surfaces grew more sensitive, the water itself began to feel different. The ocean was no longer only a place where life happened to meet life. It became a space where presence could be detected before touch, where distance began to collapse in the mind before it closed in the water. The emergence of vision did not arrive fully formed, and it did not appear all at once across the sea. It began quietly, as faint sensitivity to light, as an awareness of shadow, as a difference between brightness and dark that hinted at shape without detail. Even this was transformative. For the first time, an organism could respond to something that had not yet reached it. Movement was no longer the only signal. Contrast became information. A drifting silhouette, a passing dimness, the subtle interruption of light filtering down from above all carried meaning. The ocean, once uniform and blind, became textured. Space gained depth. time gained urgency. Once light could be sensed, chance began to lose its hold. Encounters were no longer governed solely by random collision. Detection stretched the moment before contact, turning it into a window where response became possible. Bodies that could register light, changes earlier gained time, and time became one of the most valuable resources in the sea. With even the faintest warning, an organism could adjust course, slow its movement, or surge forward. This was not yet strategy in a modern sense, but it was no longer passive. Reaction began shifting into action. As visual ability spread and refined, the ocean transformed again. Shapes grew clearer, edges sharpened, motion separated itself from background stillness. The difference between living bodies and drifting debris became easier to read. In this changing world, prey could no longer rely on being missed. Stillness, once a shield, became unreliable. Movement, once neutral, became visible. The water filled with signals that could be interpreted, chased, or avoided. Life found itself exposed not just physically, but perceptually. To be seen was to be vulnerable, and invisibility became an advantage worth pursuing. Predators, too, were reshaped by sight. The ability to locate other organisms from a distance turned hunting from a matter of chance into a sequence of decisions. Direction mattered. Speed could be applied deliberately. Energy could be conserved, spent only when a target was within reach. The ocean began to reward accuracy over endurance, precision over persistence. Bodies shifted to support this change. Eyes moved forward. Sensory organs grew more complex. Neural pathways thickened to process signals quickly enough to matter. The cost of maintaining these systems was high, but the benefit was decisive. A predator that could see did not need to wander blindly. It could choose. For prey, the spread of vision closed doors that would never reopen. The old safety of randomness faded. Survival now required responding to being detected, not merely avoiding contact. This led to a quiet but profound transformation. Patterns emerged. Camouflage took shape as bodies began to echo the colors and textures of their surroundings. Transparency offered another path, allowing some organisms to vanish into the water itself. Sudden bursts of speed became vital, not for long travel, but for brief moments of escape. Every solution grew in response to eyes searching through water that could no longer hide movement so easily. Over time, vision layered itself into the ocean's fabric. The surface grew brighter and more dangerous. The depths offered darkness, but even there, faint light and shadow continued to matter. The sea became divided not just by temperature or chemistry, but by visibility. Where light reached, detection ruled. Where it faded, other senses carried on the work, but the pattern had already been set. Awareness had entered the evolutionary conversation, and it would never leave. What began as a subtle sensitivity transformed the ocean into a place of constant observation. Life watched life. Movement invited attention. Chance retreated further into the margins, replaced by a world where being seen often mattered more than being strong. The battlefield did not emerge through violence alone. It formed through perception, through the quiet power of sight, reshaping every interaction. From that point onward, the ocean was no longer just a place where bodies met. It became a space where intentions formed in advance and where survival unfolded under an ever-widening gaze. For a long while after hunting first appeared, the ocean remained dim in more than one sense. Encounters still relied on proximity, on bodies drifting close enough for contact to occur by chance, guided by currents more than intention. Movement mattered, but awareness did not yet reach far. Life reacted rather than anticipated. This kept danger uneven and unpredictable, sometimes deadly, sometimes narrowly missed, often decided by accident as much as ability. But as bodies slowly changed, as sensory surfaces grew more sensitive, the water itself began to feel different. The ocean was no longer only a place where life happened to meet life. It became a space where presence could be detected before touch, where distance began to collapse in the mind before it closed in the water. The emergence of vision did not arrive fully formed, and it did not appear all at once across the sea. It began quietly, as faint sensitivity to light, as an awareness of shadow, as a difference between brightness and dark that hinted at shape without detail. Even this was transformative. For the first time, an organism could respond to something that had not yet reached it. Movement was no longer the only signal. Contrast became information. A drifting silhouette, a passing dimness, the subtle interruption of light filtering down from above all carried meaning. The ocean, once uniform and blind, became textured. Space gained depth. Time gained urgency. Once light could be sensed, chance began to lose its hold. Encounters were no longer governed solely by random collision. Detection stretched the moment before contact, turning it into a window where response became possible. Bodies that could register light, changes earlier gained time, and time became one of the most valuable resources in the sea. With even the faintest warning, an organism could adjust course, slow its movement, or surge forward. This was not yet strategy in a modern sense, but it was no longer passive. Reaction began shifting into action. As visual ability spread and refined, the ocean transformed again. Shapes grew clearer, edges sharpened, motion separated itself from background stillness. The difference between living bodies and drifting debris became easier to read. In this changing world, prey could no longer rely on being missed. Stillness, once a shield, became unreliable. Movement, once neutral, became visible. The water filled with signals that could be interpreted, chased, or avoided. Life found itself exposed not just physically, but perceptually. To be seen was to be vulnerable, and invisibility became an advantage worth pursuing. Predators, too, were reshaped by sight. The ability to locate other organisms from a distance turned hunting from a matter of chance into a sequence of decisions. Direction mattered. Speed could be applied deliberately. Energy could be conserved, spent only when a target was within reach. The ocean began to reward accuracy over endurance, precision over persistence. Bodies shifted to support this change. Eyes moved forward. Sensory organs grew more complex. Neural pathways thickened to process signals quickly enough to matter. The cost of maintaining these systems was high, but the benefit was decisive. A predator that could see did not need to wander blindly. It could choose. For prey, the spread of vision closed doors that would never reopen. The old safety of randomness faded. Survival now required responding to being detected, not merely avoiding contact. This led to a quiet but profound transformation. Patterns emerged. Camouflage took shape as bodies began to echo the colors and textures of their surroundings. Transparency offered another path, allowing some organisms to vanish into the water itself. Sudden bursts of speed became vital, not for long travel, but for brief moments of escape. Every solution grew in response to eyes searching through water that could no longer hide movement so easily. Over time, vision layered itself into the ocean's fabric. The surface grew brighter and more dangerous. The depths offered darkness, but even there, faint light and shadow continued to matter. The The sea became divided not just by temperature or chemistry, but by visibility. Where light reached, detection ruled. Where it faded, other senses carried on the work, but the pattern had already been set. Awareness had entered the evolutionary conversation, and it would never leave. What began as a subtle sensitivity transformed the ocean into a place of constant observation. Life watched life. Movement invited attention. Chance retreated further into the margins, replaced by a world where being seen often mattered more than being strong. The battlefield did not emerge through violence alone. It formed through perception, through the quiet power of sight, reshaping every interaction. From that point onward, the ocean was no longer just a place where bodies met. It became a space where intentions formed in advance and where survival unfolded under an ever-widening gaze. As awareness spread through the oceans and encounters became deliberate rather than accidental, bodies began to change in quiet but decisive ways. One of the earliest responses was not speed or aggression, but protection. Soft tissues that had once floated openly through the water became liabilities in a world where contact carried consequence. Gradually, surfaces thickened, minerals drawn from the surrounding sea hardened skins and strengthened outer layers. Some organisms formed shells, others developed overlapping plates, ridges, or dense coverings that absorbed force instead of yielding to it. This transformation did not happen in isolation or through careful planning. It unfolded repeatedly across unrelated lineages, guided by the same pressure. Those that endured encounters survived long enough to reproduce, while those that did not vanished without trace. Armor spread not because it was elegant, but because it worked. It bought time. It allowed damage without immediate failure. It turned deadly contact into survivable collision. Once protective coverings took hold, the ocean's balance shifted again. Defense altered the equation of survival. Predators that had once relied on soft prey found their advantage diminished. A hardened exterior could deflect bites, resist tearing, and make capture costly. For a brief span of time, armor offered a genuine edge. The sea filled with slow, heavily protected forms, moving with confidence that would have been impossible earlier. These bodies were not fast, and they were not subtle, but they could endure. In an environment where being seen was unavoidable, being difficult to kill became a powerful strategy. The ocean absorbed this change quickly, as it always did, and began to answer it. Offense responded almost immediately. The rise of armor did not end predation, it reshaped it. Predators adapted not by abandoning the hunt, but by refining it. Jaws strengthened, mouths widened. Teeth changed shape, becoming thicker, sharper, or arranged to concentrate force rather than slice. Some hunters evolved crushing bites that could crack shells outright. Others developed pointed structures that slipped between plates, exploiting weaknesses that armor could not fully close. Energy flowed toward strength, toward leverage, toward tools capable of breaking what had been built to resist. Defense had raised the cost of attack, and the ocean answered by making attacks more powerful. This exchange did not escalate slowly, it accelerated. Each improvement in protection favored more specialized methods of penetration, and each advance in offense diminished the security that armor once provided. Bodies grew heavier on both sides of the struggle. Prey invested more material into shells and plates, thickening themselves against pressure. Predators invested more energy into musculature, into reinforced jaws, into skeletal structures that could deliver force without breaking. The ocean became crowded with extremes, with forms that seem excessive when viewed through modern eyes. These were not creatures shaped by balance or efficiency. They were shaped by escalation, by a cycle that rewarded anything capable of tipping the odds even slightly. What made this arms race particularly intense was the lack of stabilizing structures in the early sea. There were no reefs to interrupt pursuit, no complex habitats to diffuse interactions. Encounters happened in open water where strength met strength directly. Retreat remained unreliable. Camouflage helped, but it could fail in moments of movement. Speed helped, but it required energy that was not always available. Armor offered consistency, and offense evolved to defeat it with equal determination. The result was a world where survival increasingly depended on extremes, not moderation. Subtle advantages were swallowed by larger forces. Only traits that dramatically altered outcomes persisted. Over time, this underwater arms race reshaped the architecture of life itself. Skeletons thickened, muscles grew denser. Bodies that might once have floated lightly through the water became heavy, deliberate, and imposing. Violence became structural, built into form rather than behavior alone. The ocean did not choose cruelty. It selected for persistence under pressure, and pressure produced confrontation. Each generation inherited a sea more demanding than the last, shaped by layers of response piled atop response. By the time this cycle had fully taken hold, the ocean had committed itself to a path. Defense and offense fed one another, tightening the corridor of viable forms. Life that remained fragile faded from the open waters or disappeared entirely. What endured was what could withstand impact or deliver it. The arms race did not erupt suddenly, it grew quietly. Inevitability layered upon inevitability until the sea itself became a place where survival meant meeting force with equal or greater force. Long before land would host its own struggles, the waters had already learned this lesson deeply and had written it into bone, shell, and muscle, leaving an imprint that would echo through all that followed. As bodies grew stronger and encounters more deliberate, survival depended increasingly on the ability to avoid contact altogether. Yet the early oceans offered few paths for escape. The water was vast, but it was also empty in a way that mattered deeply. There were no coral reefs rising like underwater cities, no forests of swaying kelp to break sightlines or movement. The sea did not yet provide structure. It was open, exposed, and uniform across long distances, leaving little room for concealment. Movement carried across uninterrupted space, and once detected, it could be followed without obstruction. In such an environment, distance alone could not guarantee safety. Running meant nothing if there was nowhere to disappear. Without reefs or rooted growth, the ocean lacked the architecture that modern life depends on. There were no narrow passages to slip through, no sudden barriers to interrupt pursuit. Currents flowed broadly, not channeled, and the seafloor offered few dramatic changes in terrain. Life unfolded in wide, shared spaces where visibility stretched far and encounters were difficult to break once they began. This openness favored endurance and tracking rather than brief, clever escapes. A predator that could maintain pursuit gained a steady advantage, while prey found that even successful evasion often delayed danger rather than ending it. The sea remembered motion, carrying scent, vibration, and wake long after a body passed through. Kelp forests, which would later soften oceans and create layered habitats, had not yet appeared. Without towering fronds to catch movement or muffle sound, the water transmitted signals cleanly. Pressure waves traveled freely, subtle shifts in current betrayed swimming bodies. Even the smallest adjustments could ripple outward, announcing presence to anything sensitive enough to feel them. For prey, this meant that fleeing left traces. For predators, It meant that escape routes remained readable even after sight was lost. The ocean did not erase footprints. It stretched them out, preserving them longer than life could outrun. The dominance of open water also shaped how bodies moved. Speed mattered, but sustained speed mattered more than bursts. Quick dashes could gain distance, but without obstacles, they rarely ended pursuit. Bodies that exhausted themselves too quickly paid a steep price. This favored forms that could move steadily, conserving energy over long stretches rather than those that relied on brief acceleration. Escape, when it happened, came through endurance, not sudden cleverness. Yet endurance required energy and oxygen, both of which remained unevenly available in early seas. Many organisms simply could not maintain flight long enough to truly break contact. The lack of vertical structure compounded this pressure. In modern oceans, depth offers refuge. Creatures can dive beneath predators or retreat upward toward light and complexity. Early seas offered fewer such gradients. Light penetrated differently, chemistry changed unpredictably, and pressure varied in ways that limited safe vertical movement. Diving too deep brought unfamiliar stresses. Rising too shallow exposed organisms to detection. Vertical escape existed, but it was risky and often temporary. The ocean pressed life into broad, shared layers where movement unfolded in full view. Because escape was unreliable, other strategies gained importance. Armor provided a chance to survive contact. Size reduced the number of potential threats. Grouping diluted individual risk. Stillness became a tactic, though an uncertain one, as detection improved. These approaches emerged not because escape was impossible, but because it was insufficient on its own. The environment demanded solutions that assumed contact would occur rather than preventing it entirely. Survival began to favor bodies that could endure pursuit, absorb damage, or present less favorable targets, rather than those that depended on vanishing into the surroundings. This open water dominance shaped the pace and intensity of life in the early seas. Encounters were prolonged, outcomes unfolded slowly, measured not in seconds but in sustained struggle. The ocean became a place where danger lingered, where threats could not easily be shaken off, and where every movement carried lasting consequences. Over time, this pressure reinforced the traits that had already begun to dominate evolution. Strength, endurance, and resilience mattered more than agility alone. The sea selected not for those who could flee brilliantly, but for those who could remain alive even when flight failed. As ages passed, life would gradually soften the ocean by building structure within it. Reefs would rise, forests would spread. Complexity would fracture open water into countless refuges. But in this early chapter, before those transformations took hold, the sea remained wide and bare. It offered space without shelter, movement without concealment, and survival without easy retreat. In such a world, escape was not a promise. It was a gamble, one that life learned, again and again, it could not always afford. As the open oceans remained exposed and encounters stretched longer and farther, survival began to favor bodies that could not be easily overwhelmed. In this world, being small carried constant risk. A smaller form was not simply vulnerable, it was reachable, manageable, and quickly subdued by anything larger or more forceful. Size determined outcomes before speed or subtlety ever had a chance to matter. In waters where escape was unreliable and defense only delayed the inevitable, being small often meant becoming part of the surrounding energy flow rather than persisting as an individual body. Over time, this pressure reshaped life in a quiet but unmistakable direction. Growth no longer functioned only as a path to reproduction, it became a shield. Larger bodies required more effort to attack, more force to damage, and more risk to consume. Size began to filter danger, reducing the number of organisms capable of turning another living thing into food. This shift did not mean that every creature grew large, but it changed the balance of survival. Lineages that could sustain growth without collapsing under their own weight persisted more easily. Those that could store energy within bulk gained resilience against long pursuits and irregular food availability. A larger body slowed temperature changes, buffered chemical swings, and allowed wounds to matter less immediately. Damage that would end a smaller organism became survivable when spread across greater mass. The ocean rewarded this stability. Gigantism emerged not as an expression of dominance, but as a strategy of endurance. It was not about overpowering everything else, but about falling outside the range of easy harm. Once a body crossed certain thresholds, many threats simply stopped applying. Ancient seas supported this growth in ways later oceans would struggle to match. Nutrient surges arrived in broad waves, feeding bursts of productivity that favored organisms capable of rapid expansion. Oxygen levels, though unstable, occasionally rose high enough to support large, energy demanding tissues. Water itself bore much of the burden of mass, allowing bodies to grow without facing the crushing constraints that gravity would later impose on land. Buoyancy softened weight. Movement scaled differently. Muscles did not need to lift bodies continuously, only to guide them. This allowed size to increase without proportional increases in structural support. The ocean became a place where being enormous was physically possible, even practical, long before it would be anywhere else. As size increased, interactions changed once again. Predators became more selective, focusing on targets that could be subdued without catastrophic injury. Prey that grew beyond a certain scale shifted the dynamics of pursuit. They were not immune to attack, but attacks became rarer and more calculated. A single mistake by a hunter could mean damage it could not afford. This introduced hesitation into a system that had previously favored relentless pressure. Size altered not only who survived, but how encounters unfolded. Movements slowed, confrontations stretched out. The ocean began to carry bodies that moved with a heavy, deliberate presence, shaping currents as they passed rather than slipping through them unnoticed. Gigantism also altered reproduction and life cycles. Larger bodies tended to live longer, giving them more opportunities to reproduce despite lower offspring numbers. This extended presence reinforced their influence on the environment. Large organisms displaced water, stirred sediments, and altered the distribution of nutrients simply by existing. Their movements carved invisible paths through the sea, reshaping the spaces smaller life occupied. Over generations, the ocean adjusted to these new giants, and in doing so, further favored forms that could either grow large themselves or exploit the margins left behind. In this early chapter of ocean life, size was not a luxury or an excess. It was a response to relentless pressure. The sea did not encourage moderation. It encouraged persistence, and persistence often required bulk. Bodies grew not because being large was impressive, but because it reduced vulnerability in a world where vulnerability carried a constant cost. Long before size would become spectacle on land, the ocean had already taught life that sometimes the safest way forward was not to hide, flee, or outmaneuver, but to grow beyond what most dangers could reasonably challenge. As the open oceans remained exposed and encounters stretched longer and farther, survival began to favor bodies that could not be easily overwhelmed. In this world, being small carried constant risk. A smaller form was not simply vulnerable, it was reachable, manageable, and quickly subdued by anything larger or more forceful. Size determined outcomes before speed or subtlety ever had a chance to matter. In waters where escape was unreliable and defense only delayed the inevitable, being small often meant becoming part of the surrounding energy flow rather than persisting as an individual body. Over time, this pressure reshaped life in a quiet but unmistakable direction. Growth no longer functioned only as a path to reproduction, it became a shield. Larger bodies required more effort to attack, more force to damage, and more risk to consume. Size began to filter danger, reducing the number of organisms capable of turning another living thing into food. This shift did not mean that every creature grew large, but it changed the balance of survival. Lineages that could sustain growth without collapsing under their own weight persisted more easily. Those that could store energy within bulk gained resilience against long pursuits and irregular food availability. A larger body slowed temperature changes, buffered chemical swings, and allowed wounds to matter less immediately. Damage that would end a smaller organism became survivable when spread across greater mass. The ocean rewarded this stability. Gigantism emerged not as an expression of dominance, but as a strategy of endurance. It was not about overpowering everything else, but about falling outside the range of easy harm. Once a body crossed certain thresholds, many threats simply stopped applying. Ancient seas supported this growth in ways later oceans would struggle to match. Nutrient surges arrived in broad waves, feeding bursts of productivity that favored organisms capable of rapid expansion. Oxygen levels, though unstable, occasionally rose high enough to support large, energy demanding tissues. Water itself bore much of the burden of mass, allowing bodies to grow without facing the crushing constraints that gravity would later impose on land. Buoyancy softened weight. Movement scaled differently. Muscles did not need to lift bodies continuously, only to guide them. This allowed size to increase without proportional increases in structural support. The ocean became a place where being enormous was physically possible, even practical, long before it would be anywhere else. As size increased, interactions changed once again. Predators became more selective, focusing on targets that could be subdued without catastrophic injury. Prey that grew beyond a certain scale shifted the dynamics of pursuit. They were not immune to attack, but attacks became rarer and more calculated. A single mistake by a hunter could mean damage it could not afford. This introduced hesitation into a system that had previously favored relentless pressure. Size altered not only who survived, but how encounters unfolded. Movements slowed, confrontations stretched out. The ocean began to carry bodies that moved with a heavy, deliberate presence, shaping currents as they passed rather than slipping through them unnoticed. Gigantism also altered reproduction and life cycles. Larger bodies tended to live longer, giving them more opportunities to reproduce despite lower offspring numbers. This extended presence reinforced their influence on the environment. Large organisms displaced water, stirred sediments, and altered the distribution of nutrients simply by existing. Their movements carved invisible paths through the sea, reshaping the spaces smaller life occupied. Over generations, the ocean adjusted to these new giants, and in doing so, further favored forms that could either grow large themselves or exploit the margins left behind. In this early chapter of ocean life, size was not a luxury or an excess. It was a response to relentless pressure. The sea did not encourage moderation. It encouraged persistence, and persistence often required bulk. Bodies grew not because being large was impressive, but because it reduced vulnerability in a world where vulnerability carried a constant cost. Long before size would become spectacle on land, the ocean had already taught life that sometimes the safest way forward was not to hide, flee, or outmaneuver, but to grow beyond what most dangers could reasonably challenge. As oxygen unlocked strength and bodies learned to express force more freely, the next transformation followed a simpler, more direct path. The ocean did not first reward planning or foresight, it rewarded outcomes. In a world where encounters often ended quickly and escape remained uncertain, effectiveness mattered more than understanding. Structures that could end a struggle decisively spread faster than systems that could analyze one. Teeth, in all their early forms, answered this demand with brutal efficiency. They required no complex processing, only alignment, pressure, and contact. Once a mouth could reliably damage or disable, it shaped survival more immediately than any emerging form of intelligence. The earliest biting structures were not refined tools, they were extensions of existing tissues, hardened edges, and protrusions shaped by repetition. Over time, these edges diversified, becoming thicker, sharper, or broader depending on use. Some specialized in slicing, others in crushing. What united them was speed of impact. Teeth altered interactions the instant they made contact. They did not require learning or memory to be effective. A body needed only to close its mouth at the right moment. In an environment already tilted toward direct confrontation, this simplicity proved decisive. Brains, by contrast, grew slowly. Nervous systems expanded in cautious steps, layered gradually onto bodies that still relied on reflex more than reasoning. Early neural networks excelled at transmitting signals quickly, triggering contraction or withdrawal, not at forming plans. This was enough. The ocean did not yet demand strategy because it did not reward hesitation. Success came from acting first and acting with sufficient force. A predator that bit accurately gained immediate advantage, regardless of whether it understood anything about its prey. Prey, in turn, faced threats that arrived with little warning and resolved encounters before learning could matter. This imbalance shaped the direction of evolution. Energy flowed toward jaws and muscles rather than enlarged processing centers. Building and maintaining a brain required stable conditions and sustained energy availability. Teeth required far less. They could be grown, replaced, or reinforced with comparatively little metabolic cost. Damage to teeth could be repaired through replacement, while damage to neural tissue often ended survival outright. The ocean selected for resilience, and teeth offered it in a way early brains could not. As a result, mouths became elaborate long before minds did. Killing efficiency rose without corresponding increases in awareness. Predators grew capable of overwhelming force without complex behavior. They did not stalk with patience or deceive with cunning. They approached, they bit, and the encounter ended. This created a feedback loop. As mouths became more dangerous, the window for response narrowed further. There was less time for detection, learning, or adjustment. Encounters became moments rather than sequences. This compressed timescale favored reflex over reflection. Simple nervous systems thrived because they acted quickly and reliably within these constraints. Over generations, teeth began to shape body form itself. Heads grew heavier and more rigid to support stronger bites. Neck muscles thickened to stabilize impact. Sensory organs aligned to guide jaws rather than survey the environment broadly. The body organized itself around the mouth as the primary interface with the world. Feeding, defense, and reproduction all revolved around it. Teeth became central not only to survival, but to identity. The ocean filled with forms whose success could be read directly in the shape of their mouths. This emphasis did not eliminate intelligence, it delayed it. Brains would eventually grow in importance, especially as environments became more structured and encounters stretched into longer sequences. But in this early, exposed ocean, intelligence remained a luxury. It offered subtle advantages where brute force already decided outcomes. Evolution followed the steepest gradient first, pushing life toward solutions that delivered immediate results. Teeth provided those results. They were simple, replaceable, and devastating. In this phase of life's story, the ocean did not value thoughtfulness. It valued finality. Bodies that could end interactions quickly left more descendants than those that merely understood them. Teeth, not brains, carried that power. Long before planning, cooperation, or learning shaped the seas, jaws had already written their influence into bone and cartilage, establishing a world where success depended less on knowing and more on doing. The legacy of that early imbalance would linger, echoing through marine life long after brains eventually caught up, reminding us that for a long stretch of Earth's history, effectiveness mattered more than awareness, and the mouth ruled long before the mind. As teeth hardened, muscles strengthened, and size pushed bodies beyond easy threat, a new condition quietly took shape in the ancient oceans. Some predators no longer faced meaningful resistance. They did not merely succeed often, they succeeded consistently. Over time, this reliability reshaped entire ecosystems, bending them around a single dominant presence. Where these predators moved, other life adjusted its behavior, its timing, and even its form. Feeding patterns shifted, migration paths altered. Smaller hunters faded or specialized narrowly to avoid overlap. The ocean began to organize itself not around balance, but around avoidance and accommodation. This marked the arrival of the first true apex predators, creatures whose position was not temporary or contested, but structurally embedded in their world. Without competitors capable of challenging them, these apex forms occupied a singular role. They did not need speed beyond what was sufficient, nor strategy beyond what was immediate. Their presence alone influenced survival outcomes across multiple layers of life. Prey species evolved in response to the certainty of predation rather than its unpredictability. Some became more heavily armored. Others matured faster, reproducing before inevitable loss. Still, others shifted their activity to different depths or times, narrowing their window of exposure. Even other predators adjusted, avoiding direct encounters that would end poorly. The ecosystem flexed and reshaped itself around this dominance, as if gravity had intensified in one place and everything else adjusted its orbit. This dominance created a form of stability, though not a gentle one. When a single predator sits above all others, conflict narrows rather than spreads. Instead of many competing hunters exerting pressure from multiple directions, pressure becomes focused. The apex predator dictates the rhythm of mortality. Its feeding cycles establish patterns that ripple outward through the food web. Populations fluctuate within boundaries, set not by chaos, but by the steady presence of an unbeatable force. In this way, dominance reduces uncertainty. Life adapts to predictability, even when that predictability includes loss. The ocean learned to live with the shadow of giants. Because nothing could stop these apex predators directly, limits emerged indirectly. Their numbers remained low, constrained by the energy required to sustain such power. They shaped ecosystems broadly, but lightly in density. Their influence came not from abundance, but from certainty. Each individual mattered enormously. The absence or presence of a single apex body could change the flow of life across wide regions. Smaller creatures sensed this through pressure rather than perception, responding to altered currents of risk without ever seeing the cause. The predator did not need to hunt constantly to exert control. Its existence alone was enough. Over time, this condition reinforced itself. Apex predators experienced little selective pressure to refine subtle traits. They did not need speed beyond what prey possessed. They did not need deception where force sufficed. Their bodies stabilized around reliable designs, optimized not for innovation but for maintenance of dominance. Change slowed at the top, even as it accelerated below. This contrast hardened the structure of early marine ecosystems, locking in roles that would persist until environments themselves shifted. When nothing can stop you, survival takes on a different character. Injury becomes the primary threat rather than competition. Energy management outweighs innovation. Long lifespans become possible as encounters rarely end badly for the dominant form. This longevity further amplifies influence, allowing a single body to shape the environment over many cycles. The ocean grows accustomed to these long-lived rulers, incorporating their presence into its rhythms. Disturbance becomes noticeable not when they act, but when they are absent. This era of unchecked dominance did not produce balance, but it produced order of a kind. Life arranged itself around certainty. Extremes flourished at the top. Specialization crept into the margins, and the middle thinned. The ocean became quieter in some ways, less crowded with competing threats, yet heavier with consequence. Every encounter carried the weight of hierarchy, even when the apex predator was nowhere in sight. This condition would not last forever. Environments change, and stability built on dominance is sensitive to shifts in chemistry, temperature, and energy. But for a long stretch of deep time, the oceans belonged to creatures that had no rivals. Their rule was not dramatic or constant. It was patient, pervasive, and absolute. In their presence, life learned that sometimes survival is shaped not by constant struggle, but by the silent certainty that one form stands above all others, unchallenged, unhurried, and woven deeply into the structure of the world itself. As armor failed and force took its place, another quiet influence pressed steadily from all sides. Temperature shaped the pace of life beneath the waves, and in warm oceans, that pace quickened into something unyielding. Heat moved easily through water, surrounding bodies completely and continuously. Unlike life on land, there was no relief from shade or nightfall, no pause where activity could cool and reset. In these ancient seas, warmth settled in and stayed, raising the baseline of every living process. Cells worked faster, muscles recovered more quickly. Energy moved through bodies with fewer delays. The ocean did not merely feel warmer, it behaved differently, accelerating the rhythm of survival itself. In warmer water, digestion sped up. Meals passed through bodies more quickly, converting flesh into usable energy with little delay. This shortened the time between hunger and action. Predators could not afford to be idle because their bodies demanded constant intake to support their elevated internal pace. Feeding became frequent rather than occasional. Hunting was no longer an event separated by long rest. It became a repeating cycle, woven directly into daily movement. The ocean filled with bodies that were always on the edge of needing more, driven forward by metabolisms that refused to slow. Faster digestion also meant faster growth. Juveniles reached functional size more quickly, entering the cycle of predation sooner. This compressed lifespans in some lineages while extending influence in others. Energy flowed rapidly from prey to predator, then onward again, creating a system where turnover was high and stability fragile. Warmth encouraged constant motion, constant interaction, constant pressure. Nothing lingered gently. Everything was pulled forward by internal chemistry tuned to speed. Muscles behaved differently in this environment. Warm water allowed fibers to contract with greater efficiency, delivering power repeatedly without long recovery. Swimming grew stronger and more sustained. Bursts of speed came more easily, and endurance stretched farther. This did not create elegance, it created persistence. Predators could pursue longer. Prey had fewer chances to outlast their attackers. Encounters that might have ended through fatigue in cooler conditions continued until one body failed. Heat narrowed the gap between effort and exhaustion, favoring those already built for force. Aggression, in this context, did not arise from intent or emotion. It emerged from necessity. High metabolic demand meant that waiting carried cost. Hesitation burned energy without return. Action, even risky action, became preferable to restraint. Bodies evolved to close distance rather than circle it. Encounters became direct, not because life grew cruel, but because warmth made delay expensive. The ocean learned to reward decisiveness, reinforcing patterns already set by strength, size, and sharpness. Warm seas also supported richer, faster moving food chains. Primary productivity rose where nutrients and light aligned with heat, feeding dense populations that could sustain relentless predation. This abundance did not soften interactions, it intensified them. More food meant more bodies, more competition, and more frequent encounters. The ocean grew crowded with motion. Pressure came, not only from above or below, but from all directions at once. In such conditions, aggression became structural, built into the flow of energy itself. The danger of warm oceans did not lie in any single predator or adaptation. It lay in the speed at which everything happened. Mistakes carried immediate consequences. Wounds healed less slowly, but they also accumulated quickly. Energy was abundant, but so were demands. Life balanced constantly between growth and collapse, driven by a pace that left little room for error. In cooler waters, survival could stretch out, buffered by slower processes. In warm seas, survival unfolded in compressed time, where success and failure followed closely on one another. As these warm conditions persisted, they reinforced earlier trends. Large bodies benefited from rapid energy turnover, strong bites paired with quick recovery, endurance combined with urgency. The ocean did not calm under heat, it sharpened. Each interaction fed into the next, creating a continuous chain of pressure that favored those able to operate at full capacity without pause. Through this long chapter, warmth acted as an unseen accelerator. It did not create predators, but it fueled them. It did not invent violence, but it removed the delays that once softened it. The ancient seas grew dangerous not because they were filled with monsters, but because they moved faster than life could afford to hesitate. In warm water, the ocean pressed life toward constant action, and in doing so, it forged a world where danger was not exceptional, but ordinary, flowing quietly and endlessly through every living body. As armor failed and force took its place, another quiet influence pressed steadily from all sides. Temperature shaped the pace of life beneath the waves, and in warm oceans, that pace quickened into something unyielding. Heat moved easily through water, surrounding bodies completely and continuously. Unlike life on land, there was no relief from shade or nightfall, no pause where activity could cool and reset. In these ancient seas, warmth settled in and stayed, raising the baseline of every living process. Cells worked faster, muscles recovered more quickly, energy moved through bodies with fewer delays. The ocean did not merely feel warmer, it behaved differently, accelerating the rhythm of survival itself. In warmer water, digestion sped up. Meals passed through bodies more quickly, converting flesh into usable energy with little delay. This shortened the time between hunger and action. Predators could not afford to be idle because their bodies demanded constant intake to support their elevated internal pace. Feeding became frequent rather than occasional. Hunting was no longer an event separated by long rest. It became a repeating cycle, woven directly into daily movement. The ocean filled with bodies that were always on the edge of needing more, driven forward by metabolisms that refused to slow. Faster digestion also meant faster growth. Juveniles reached functional size more quickly, entering the cycle of predation sooner. This compressed lifespans in some lineages while extending influence in others. Energy flowed rapidly from prey to predator, then onward again, creating a system where turnover was high and stability fragile. Warmth encouraged constant motion, constant interaction, constant pressure. Nothing lingered gently. Everything was pulled forward by internal chemistry tuned to speed. Muscles behaved differently in this environment. Warm water allowed fibers to contract with greater efficiency, delivering power repeatedly without long recovery. Swimming grew stronger and more sustained. Bursts of speed came more easily, and endurance stretched farther. This did not create elegance, it created persistence. Predators could pursue longer. Prey had fewer chances to outlast their attackers. Encounters that might have ended through fatigue in cooler conditions continued until one body failed. Heat narrowed the gap between effort and exhaustion, favoring those already built for force. Aggression, in this context, did not arise from intent or emotion. It emerged from necessity. High metabolic demand meant that waiting carried cost. Hesitation burned energy without return. Action, even risky action, became preferable to restraint. Bodies evolved to close distance rather than circle it. Encounters became direct, not because life grew cruel, but because warmth made delay expensive. The ocean learned to reward decisiveness, reinforcing patterns already set by strength, size, and sharpness. Warm seas also supported richer, faster moving food chains. Primary productivity rose where nutrients and light aligned with heat, feeding dense populations that could sustain relentless predation. This abundance did not soften interactions, it intensified them. More food meant more bodies, more competition, and more frequent encounters. The ocean grew crowded with motion. Pressure came, not only from above or below, but from all directions at once. In such conditions, aggression became structural, built into the flow of energy itself. The danger of warm oceans did not lie in any single predator or adaptation. It lay in the speed at which everything happened. Mistakes carried immediate consequences. Wounds healed less slowly, but they also accumulated quickly. Energy was abundant, but so were demands. Life balanced constantly between growth and collapse, driven by a pace that left little room for error. In cooler waters, survival could stretch out, buffered by slower processes. In warm seas, survival unfolded in compressed time, where success and failure followed closely on one another. As these warm conditions persisted, they reinforced earlier trends. Large bodies benefited from rapid energy turnover, strong bites paired with quick recovery, endurance combined with urgency. The ocean did not calm under heat, it sharpened. Each interaction fed into the next, creating a continuous chain of pressure that favored those able to operate at full capacity without pause. Through this long chapter, warmth acted as an unseen accelerator. It did not create predators, but it fueled them. It did not invent violence, but it removed the delays that once softened it. The ancient seas grew dangerous not because they were filled with monsters, but because they moved faster than life could afford to hesitate. In warm water, the ocean pressed life toward constant action, and in doing so, it forged a world where danger was not exceptional, but ordinary, flowing quietly and endlessly through every living body. As armor failed and force took its place, another quiet influence pressed steadily from all sides. Temperature shaped the pace of life beneath the waves, and in warm oceans, that pace quickened into something unyielding. Heat moved easily through water, surrounding bodies completely and continuously. Unlike life on land, there was no relief from shade or nightfall, no pause where activity could cool and reset. In these ancient seas, warmth settled in and stayed, raising the baseline of every living process. Cells worked faster, muscles recovered more quickly, energy moved through bodies with fewer delays. The ocean did not merely feel warmer, it behaved differently, accelerating the rhythm of survival itself. In warmer water, digestion sped up. Meals passed through bodies more quickly, converting flesh into usable energy with little delay. This shortened the time between hunger and action. Predators could not afford to be idle because their bodies demanded constant intake to support their elevated internal pace. Feeding became frequent rather than occasional. Hunting was no longer an event separated by long rest. It became a repeating cycle, woven directly into daily movement. The ocean filled with bodies that were always on the edge of needing more, driven forward by metabolisms that refused to slow. Faster digestion also meant faster growth. Juveniles reached functional size more quickly, entering the cycle of predation sooner. This compressed lifespans in some lineages while extending influence in others. Energy flowed rapidly from prey to predator, then onward again, creating a system where turnover was high and stability fragile. Warmth encouraged constant motion, constant interaction, constant pressure. Nothing lingered gently. Everything was pulled forward by internal chemistry tuned to speed. Muscles behaved differently in this environment. Warm water allowed fibers to contract with greater efficiency, delivering power repeatedly without long recovery. Swimming grew stronger and more sustained. Bursts of speed came more easily, and endurance stretched farther. This did not create elegance, it created persistence. Predators could pursue longer. Prey had fewer chances to outlast their attackers. Encounters that might have ended through fatigue in cooler conditions continued until one body failed. Heat narrowed the gap between effort and exhaustion, favoring those already built for force. Aggression, in this context, did not arise from intent or emotion. It emerged from necessity. High metabolic demand meant that waiting carried cost. Hesitation burned energy without return. Action, even risky action, became preferable to restraint. Bodies evolved to close distance rather than circle it. Encounters became direct, not because life grew cruel, but because warmth made delay expensive. The ocean learned to reward decisiveness, reinforcing patterns already set by strength, size, and sharpness. Warm seas also supported richer, faster-moving food chains. Primary productivity rose where nutrients and light aligned with heat, feeding dense populations that could sustain relentless predation. This abundance did not soften interactions, it intensified them. More food meant more bodies, more competition, and more frequent encounters. The ocean grew crowded with motion. Pressure came, not only from above or below, but from all directions at once. In such conditions, aggression became structural, built into the flow of energy itself. The danger of warm oceans did not lie in any single predator or adaptation. It lay in the speed at which everything happened. Mistakes carried immediate consequences. Wounds healed less slowly, but they also accumulated quickly. Energy was abundant, but so were demands. Life balanced constantly between growth and collapse, driven by a pace that left little room for error. In cooler waters, survival could stretch out, buffered by slower processes. In warm seas, survival unfolded in compressed time, where success and failure followed closely on one another. As these warm conditions persisted, they reinforced earlier trends. Large bodies benefited from rapid energy turnover, strong bites paired with quick recovery, endurance combined with urgency. The ocean did not calm under heat, it sharpened. Each interaction fed into the next, creating a continuous chain of pressure that favored those able to operate at full capacity without pause. Through this long chapter, warmth acted as an unseen accelerator. It did not create predators, but it fueled them. It did not invent violence, but it removed the delays that once softened it. The ancient seas grew dangerous not because they were filled with monsters, but because they moved faster than life could afford to hesitate. In warm water, the ocean pressed life toward constant action, and in doing so, it forged a world where danger was not exceptional, but ordinary, flowing quietly and endlessly through every living body. As generations of fish refined force, speed, and efficiency within the limits of water breathing, a new kind of hunter began to enter the sea from above. These were not creatures shaped entirely by the ocean's rules from birth. They came from a world of air, where lungs filled and emptied freely, where oxygen was abundant and movement demanded strength against gravity rather than buoyancy. When these air-breathing reptiles slipped back into the water, they carried with them an unfamiliar advantage. They were no longer bound to extract oxygen from water moment by moment. Instead, they arrived already charged, diving with full lungs, their bodies storing breath like fuel. This changed the rhythm of pursuit completely. Hunting was no longer tied to constant respiration. Movement could become uninterrupted, focused, and sustained in a way few marine animals could yet match. With lungs came endurance. These new marine reptiles did not need to slow, filter water, or pause to breathe during a chase. They could accelerate, turn, and pursue without breaking contact, driving forward on stored air while their prey struggled to balance oxygen intake with escape. This single shift stretched the length of encounters dramatically. A chase no longer ended because the predator tired first. It ended when the hunted body failed. Long pursuits became possible across open water, through depth changes, and along coastlines. The ocean, already dangerous, gained a new dimension of pressure. Now there were hunters that could wait beneath the surface, watching, conserving energy, then explode into motion with power that did not immediately demand rest. Their bodies soon followed their breath into transformation, limbs reshaped into flippers or powerful paddles, optimized not for gentle swimming but for thrust. Spines stiffened, turning torsos into solid levers capable of transferring force efficiently through water. Tails lengthened and strengthened, delivering sustained propulsion instead of short bursts. Heads grew heavy and stable, supporting jaws built to grip and hold rather than nip and release. Teeth evolved not just to cut, but to secure prey during long struggles, preventing escape once contact was made. every part of the body aligned toward pursuit that did not have to stop. This combination of endurance and power altered the balance of marine predation deeply. Fish that had once relied on outlasting attackers found that strategy stripped away. Armor alone offered little help against hunters that could reposition endlessly, testing weaknesses until one failed. Speed offered only temporary reprieve if it could not be maintained. The ocean's open spaces, once neutral, now worked in favor of the pursuer. There were few places to hide from a hunter that did not need to breathe where you did. Water became a medium of capture rather than refuge. Because these reptiles returned to air between hunts, their recovery followed a different rhythm. They could process oxygen efficiently at the surface, reset quickly, and dive again with full capacity. This allowed repeated hunting efforts within short spans, increasing pressure across entire ecosystems. Their presence reshaped feeding patterns below them and behavior above them. Coastal waters became especially dangerous as shallow regions offered little depth to escape and clear paths for sustained pursuit. Life adjusted again, bending around hunters that did not tire when expected and did not leave when prey hoped they would. Over time, this new style of predation pushed the ocean even further toward specialization and lethality. Marine reptiles filled roles that water-breathing predators could not easily contest. They controlled wide territories not through numbers, but through certainty. Their movements stitched together regions of the sea that had once functioned separately, spreading pressure across long distances. Prey populations learned to move differently, cluster differently, and sometimes abandon regions altogether in response. The ocean's geography of danger shifted once more, redrawn by creatures that crossed boundaries between air and water with ease. This was not merely an increase in violence, it was an escalation in capability. Air breathing freed hunters from immediate metabolic limits, allowing force to be applied continuously rather than in short cycles. Endurance became a weapon. The ability to wait, chase, and strike without interruption placed marine reptiles at the top of an already brutal hierarchy. Their arrival did not erase earlier predators, but it overshadowed them, raising the ceiling of what killing could look like in the sea. As these reptiles spread and diversified, the ancient oceans entered one of their most formidable phases. Predation was no longer constrained by breath, by brief effort, or by local advantage. It flowed across space and time with relentless consistency. The sea, which had already taught life to sharpen itself, now hosted hunters whose very existence stretched the limits of pursuit. In their wake, survival demanded not just strength or speed, but strategies that acknowledged a new truth. The ocean was no longer ruled only by those born into water, but by those who brought the power of air with them and refused to slow once the chase had begun. As marine reptiles raised the ceiling of endurance and pursuit, the structure of ocean life beneath them grew increasingly compressed. Ancient food chains did not stretch upward through many gentle steps. They rose abruptly, with few layers separating those that were eaten from those that did the eating. Energy moved quickly and directly, flowing from small bodies into larger ones with little detour. There were few intermediaries to soften losses or redistribute pressure. When one link faltered, everything above or below felt the shift almost immediately. This brevity defined the character of early marine ecosystems and shaped their violence as surely as Jaws or Speed ever could. In these early oceans, primary life forms surged and faded in bursts, rather than persisting at stable levels. Plankton blooms could appear suddenly when conditions aligned, feeding vast numbers of small organisms that grew quickly and reproduced in short spans. Those small organisms, in turn, became concentrated packets of energy, easy to consume and convert into growth by larger predators. Because there were few specialized feeders between these stages, energy skipped upward rapidly. A change at the base of the system reverberated almost instantly at the top. The ocean behaved less like a layered pyramid and more like a narrow channel, where flow accelerated rather than dispersed. This structure made collapse a frequent feature rather than an exception. When environmental conditions shifted through changes in temperature, chemistry, or nutrient flow, populations could fall sharply. Predators faced sudden shortages. Some perished, others withdrew or shifted their focus. But the same conditions that caused collapse often set the stage for rapid recovery. With fewer consumers, remaining prey rebounded quickly, sometimes explosively. The system oscillated between abundance and scarcity, rarely settling into equilibrium. Life learned to endure volatility rather than avoid it. Violence thrived in this instability because it offered quick resolution. In a system where resources fluctuated sharply, prolonged competition was costly. Predators that could secure food decisively gained an edge over those that relied on long chases or selective feeding. Prey species evolved to reproduce quickly and in large numbers, accepting loss as inevitable. The ocean did not reward restraint or balance. It rewarded speed in both consumption and replacement. Encounters were direct, and outcomes arrived swiftly. Few layers between prey and predator also meant few buffers against dominance. Apex hunters exerted disproportionate influence, shaping entire systems through their feeding alone. When such predators increased even slightly, pressure intensified across multiple species at once. When they declined, prey surged without gradual moderation. This amplified swings in population and behavior, reinforcing a cycle of boom and bust. Stability, when it appeared, was temporary and fragile, easily disrupted by shifts that would have been absorbed in more complex systems. The simplicity of these food chains did not reflect a lack of diversity, but a lack of partitioning. Many organisms occupied broad, overlapping roles rather than narrow niches. Flexibility mattered more than specialization because conditions changed too quickly to support fine-tuned dependencies. This led to direct competition and frequent overlap between predator roles, increasing the frequency of lethal encounters. Violence was not confined to distinct levels. It spilled across boundaries, blurring lines between hunter and hunted as roles shifted with size, age, and opportunity. Constant instability also shaped behavior across generations. Life adapted to expect disruption rather than continuity. Short lifespans, rapid growth, and early reproduction became common responses. Energy investment favored immediate payoff rather than long-term efficiency. Bodies and behaviors reflected this urgency, optimized for moments rather than lifetimes. The ocean learned to function not as a carefully balanced machine, but as a dynamic system in continual adjustment. As ages passed, this pattern left a deep imprint. The ancient seas became places where survival depended on withstanding sudden change and capitalizing on brief windows of opportunity. Food chains remained short because long ones could not survive frequent collapse. Violence remained common because it resolved competition quickly in an environment that rarely allowed prolonged negotiation. Instability became the defining context in which all other traits operated. In this restless world, life endured not by smoothing extremes, but by moving fluidly between them. Collapse and rebound formed the heartbeat of early marine ecosystems, driving evolution forward in pulses rather than steps. The result was an ocean that felt perpetually on edge, shaped by abrupt flows of energy and consequence. Ancient food chains were short and violent not because life lacked the potential for complexity, but because the world they occupied demanded speed, decisiveness, and resilience in the face of constant change. The great die-offs that swept through ancient seas did not arrive as gentle corrections. They came as abrupt clearings, wiping away entire communities with a speed that left little time for adjustment. Chemistry shifted, temperatures swung, oxygen fell or surged. In moments measured by geology rather than breath, dominance collapsed along with diversity. The ocean did not mourn its losses, it emptied. Where once bodies crowded the water, there were suddenly wide spaces, silent currents, and unclaimed energy drifting without direction. Extinction did not soften the sea, it stripped it bare. When mass loss erased competitors, it did more than reduce numbers. It dismantled relationships. Food chains snapped rather than shortened. Specialized interactions vanished. Predators that had depended on particular prey disappeared alongside them. Defenses honed for familiar threats became irrelevant overnight. The sea returned to a simpler state, not peaceful, but open. Survivors found themselves in an environment that no longer resembled the one that had shaped them. Familiar pressures faded, replaced by opportunity wrapped in uncertainty. Those that endured did not emerge into a balanced world. They inherited empty seas. Vast stretches of water held nutrients with few mouths to claim them. Energy pooled without structure. With fewer rivals and fewer constraints, growth accelerated, bodies expanded, ranges widened. Survivors spread outward, encountering little resistance as they filled niches that had been erased rather than vacated. This expansion was not careful or measured. It was rapid and uneven, driven by lineages already shaped to exploit instability. In these reset oceans, dominance found new paths. With competition reduced, traits that conferred decisive advantage rose quickly. Speed mattered again until it met size. Size mattered until it met strength. Strength mattered until something stronger appeared. The cycle repeated, familiar in shape even as the players changed. Extinction cleared the board, but it did not change the rules. The environment still rewarded effectiveness over restraint, decisiveness over balance. Survivors that could seize control early shaped the new ecosystem around themselves, much as earlier apex predators had done before the collapse. This pattern repeated across deep time. Each mass die-off acted like a storm that flattened a forest, removing old growth and exposing raw ground. What grew back was not a return of what had been lost, but a reassembly guided by the same pressures that had always ruled the sea. With fewer species to dilute energy flow, food chains shortened again. Violence intensified briefly as new hierarchies formed. Innovation surged where opportunity allowed, then slowed as dominance settled in once more. Extinction also favored traits that could endure disruption. Lineages with flexible diets, rapid reproduction, and broad tolerances survived resets more often than those finely tuned to narrow conditions. These survivors carried forward tendencies shaped by chaos, ready to expand quickly when competitors vanished. As a result, each reset began not from neutrality, but from a starting point already biased toward dominance. The ocean did not relearn gentleness. It reinforced its preference for forms that could seize advantage fast. What followed extinction was not calm, but acceleration. Recovery phases often produced some of the most extreme organisms the sea would ever host. With abundant resources and few checks, bodies grew large. Predators rose quickly to the top, Ecosystems reorganized around whichever lineage moved fastest to fill the void. Only later, as diversity slowly returned, did interactions become more complex and pressures spread across more layers. Even then, the memory of collapse lingered in the structure of the system, keeping it prone to instability. Through these cycles, extinction acted less like an ending and more like a reset button. It erased old hierarchies without erasing the forces that created them. The sea returned again and again to familiar patterns, rebuilding dominance in new forms, with new bodies, under new conditions. Each wave of loss cleared space for innovation, but it also cleared away moderation. What survived the reset shaped the next era, and those survivors were rarely gentle. In this way, the ancient oceans remained restless across eons. They did not progress steadily toward balance. They pulsed. Collapse opened space. Survivors surged. Dominance returned. Life adapted not to permanence, but to repetition. Extinction did not teach the sea restraint. It taught it renewal through force. And so, after each great loss, the waters did not grow kinder. They sharpened again, assembling worlds that would, in time, be erased and rebuilt once more. The great die-offs that swept through ancient seas did not arrive as gentle corrections. They came as abrupt clearings, wiping away entire communities with a speed that left little time for adjustment. Chemistry shifted, temperatures swung, oxygen fell or surged. In moments measured by geology rather than breath, dominance collapsed along with diversity. The ocean did not mourn its losses, it emptied. Where once bodies crowded the water, there were suddenly wide spaces, silent currents, and unclaimed energy drifting without direction. Extinction did not soften the sea, it stripped it bare. When mass loss erased competitors, it did more than reduce numbers. It dismantled relationships. Food chains snapped rather than shortened. Specialized interactions vanished. Predators that had depended on particular prey disappeared alongside them. Defenses honed for familiar threats became irrelevant overnight. The sea returned to a simpler state, not peaceful, but open. Survivors found themselves in an environment that no longer resembled the one that had shaped them. Familiar pressures faded, replaced by opportunity wrapped in uncertainty. Those that endured did not emerge into a balanced world. They inherited empty seas. Vast stretches of water held nutrients with few mouths to claim them. Energy pooled without structure. With fewer rivals and fewer constraints, growth accelerated, bodies expanded, ranges widened. Survivors spread outward, encountering little resistance as they filled niches that had been erased rather than vacated. This expansion was not careful or measured. It was rapid and uneven, driven by lineages already shaped to exploit instability. In these reset oceans, dominance found new paths. With competition reduced, traits that conferred decisive advantage rose quickly. Speed mattered again until it met size. Size mattered until it met strength. Strength mattered until something stronger appeared. The cycle repeated, familiar in shape even as the players changed. Extinction cleared the board, but it did not change the rules. The environment still rewarded effectiveness over restraint, decisiveness over balance. Survivors that could seize control early shaped the new ecosystem around themselves, much as earlier apex predators had done before the collapse. This pattern repeated across deep time. Each mass die-off acted like a storm that flattened a forest, removing old growth and exposing raw ground. What grew back was not a return of what had been lost, but a reassembly guided by the same pressures that had always ruled the sea. With fewer species to dilute energy flow, food chains shortened again. Violence intensified briefly as new hierarchies formed. Innovation surged where opportunity allowed, then slowed as dominance settled in once more. Extinction also favored traits that could endure disruption. Lineages with flexible diets, rapid reproduction, and broad tolerances survived resets more often than those finely tuned to narrow conditions. These survivors carried forward tendencies shaped by chaos, ready to expand quickly when competitors vanished. As a result, each reset began not from neutrality, but from a starting point already biased toward dominance. The ocean did not relearn gentleness. It reinforced its preference for forms that could seize advantage fast. What followed extinction was not calm, but acceleration. Recovery phases often produced some of the most extreme organisms the sea would ever host. With abundant resources and few checks, bodies grew large. Predators rose quickly to the top. Ecosystems reorganized around whichever lineage moved fastest to fill the void. Only later, as diversity slowly returned, did interactions become more complex and pressures spread across more layers. Even then, the memory of collapse lingered in the structure of the system, keeping it prone to instability. Through these cycles, extinction acted less like an ending and more like a reset button. It erased old hierarchies without erasing the forces that created them. The sea returned again and again to familiar patterns, rebuilding dominance in new forms, with new bodies, under new conditions. Each wave of loss cleared space for innovation, but it also cleared away moderation. What survived the reset shaped the next era, and those survivors were rarely gentle. In this way, the ancient oceans remained restless across eons. They did not progress steadily toward balance. They pulsed. Collapse opened space. Survivors surged. Dominance returned. Life adapted not to permanence, but to repetition. Extinction did not teach the sea restraint. It taught it renewal through force. And so, after each great loss, the waters did not grow kinder. They sharpened again, assembling worlds that would, in time, be erased and rebuilt once more. As specialization sharpened bodies into precise tools and dominance returned in cycles, the path life followed remained surprisingly direct. The ocean did not rush toward thought, it leaned into force. For a long stretch of its history, problems were immediate and unforgiving, and solutions that acted quickly mattered more than those that understood deeply. Encounters unfolded at close range, often decided in moments. In such conditions, planning offered little advantage. A body that could deliver decisive action reliably outperformed one that hesitated, evaluated, or adjusted. Force worked, not because it was elegant, but because it matched the pace of the environment. The structure of ancient seas reinforced this preference. Open water left little room for long-term strategy. Visibility was limited, movement continuous, and encounters unpredictable in timing, but swift in outcome. A complex brain requires energy, time, and stability to justify its cost. Early marine ecosystems provided none of these consistently. Energy surged and vanished, food chains collapsed and rebuilt, extinction reset conditions repeatedly. In a world so prone to disruption, investing heavily in cognitive complexity brought risks without immediate reward. Brains could not protect against sudden crushing force or overwhelming speed. Teeth and muscle could. Nervous systems did evolve, but they followed a different path. Early networks emphasized speed of response over depth of processing. Reflexes mattered more than memory. Rapid signal transmission allowed bodies to contract, turn, or bite at the right instant. This was sufficient. The ocean did not yet demand prediction, it demanded reaction. A creature that responded instantly to pressure or motion survived more often than one that paused to interpret patterns. Violence resolved encounters quickly, narrowing the window where intelligence could influence outcomes. As predators refined killing efficiency, this pressure intensified. Encounters grew shorter, more decisive. Specialized tools removed ambiguity. When a predator's form was perfectly matched to a specific kill, little reasoning was required. Success lay in alignment rather than adaptation. The ocean favored solutions that ended problems rather than managed them. In this environment, intelligence lagged not because it lacked potential, but because it lacked opportunity. There was little room to learn from mistakes when mistakes ended lives immediately. The energetic cost of brains also mattered deeply. Neural tissue consumes large amounts of energy continuously, even at rest. In ancient seas where resources fluctuated and metabolic demand already ran high, this cost was difficult to sustain. Investing that energy into stronger muscles, thicker jaws, or faster recovery produced more reliable returns. Evolution followed efficiency, and efficiency favored physical solutions that delivered immediate survival. Brains, which promise flexibility and foresight, pay off over time. Time was precisely what many organisms did not have. Only gradually did conditions begin to shift. As ecosystems gained layers and interactions stretched over longer sequences, new kinds of challenges emerged. Prey learned to anticipate rather than merely flee. Predators encountered resistance that could not always be overcome through force alone. Reefs and complex habitats began to break lines of sight, encounters lengthened, opportunities for memory, recognition, and adjustment increased. In these quieter pockets of the sea, intelligence began to matter. It was no longer enough to strike hard. It became useful to choose when and where to strike. Even then, intelligence did not replace force. It complemented it. Brains evolved alongside strong bodies, not instead of them. Planning enhanced lethality rather than reducing it. The ability to learn patterns, remember locations, and coordinate movements added another layer of effectiveness to predators already shaped by eons of physical refinement. Intelligence arrived not as a gentling influence, but as an amplifier, allowing violence to be applied more selectively and efficiently. This delayed arrival reflects the ocean's long priorities. For most of its history, survival depended on meeting pressure directly. Problems needed to be ended, not analyzed. Violence solved them faster. Only when the environment slowed enough, when space for error appeared, did intelligence begin to pay for itself. By then, the ocean had already forged bodies capable of immense force, and minds grew within that context, shaped by it rather than separate from it. The late rise of intelligence in the sea is not a story of absence, but of timing. Thought waited until the world allowed it to matter. When it finally emerged, it did so quietly, layered onto systems built for speed and strength. The ancient oceans did not ignore intelligence, they postponed it. They demanded that life first master the art of survival through force, before granting the space to think beyond it. There came a span of deep time when all the pressures shaping the sea aligned at once, and the ocean reached a state unlike anything before or since. Strength had accumulated, endurance had been unlocked. Specialization had narrowed bodies into precise instruments. Warm waters kept metabolism high and rest brief. Oxygen still flowed generously enough to support power without restraint. Food chains remained short, collapses frequent, recovery rapid. This was the moment when danger peaked, not because new traits appeared, but because every existing one reinforced the others without resistance. The sea did not merely host predators, it became an engine for aggression. During this phase, the ocean supported maximum pressure at every level. Large hunters moved continuously, unburdened by limits that would later emerge. Smaller predators filled the spaces beneath them, equally refined for their own targets. Prey lived under constant exposure, shaped by necessity rather than choice. There were few places to pause and no long stretches of safety. Warmth accelerated movement and recovery. Abundant oxygen fed muscle and bite. Specialization reduced wasted effort. Encounters were decisive and frequent, unfolding across open water and along coastlines that offered little shelter. Energy moved fast, and life adapted to keep pace or vanish. Aggression, in this context, was not chaotic. It was structured, sustained, and efficient. The sea did not boil with constant motion, but it never truly rested. Hunting followed rhythms, and those rhythms overlapped, ensuring that pressure never fully lifted. When one predator paused, another filled the gap. When one lineage declined, another expanded quickly, inheriting its role and refining it further. Each extinction reset earlier had stripped away hesitation and reinforced dominance. Now, with multiple waves behind it, the ocean carried a memory of violence in its very structure. This was the apex of marine lethality because nothing yet moderated these forces. Cooling had not begun to slow metabolism. Complex habitats had not fully formed to break lines of pursuit. Intelligence had not yet spread widely enough to introduce restraint or cooperation as alternatives to force. The environment rewarded speed, power, and decisiveness almost exclusively. Bodies optimized for killing thrived. Those that required time, care, or stability faded quickly. Survival strategies converged toward aggression not because it was chosen, but because it worked consistently under prevailing conditions. At this peak, encounters resolved swiftly. A predator rarely needed to attempt multiple attacks. Tools were well matched to targets. Teeth met bone with sufficient force. Limbs drove bodies forward without fatigue. Air-breathing hunters extended pressure vertically and horizontally, closing escape routes that once existed. The ocean grew smaller in functional terms, even as it remained vast in size. Danger could arrive from nearly any direction, sustained until resolution. Life adjusted by shortening its expectations. Longevity depended less on avoiding danger entirely and more on enduring it repeatedly. This intensity did not produce balance, it produced saturation. Aggressive traits spread rapidly until many lineages shared them, competing within narrow margins. Small advantages mattered enormously. Slight differences in speed, timing, or strength decided survival. Evolution moved quickly but narrowly, refining what already worked rather than exploring new directions. The sea became full of specialists honed to a sharp edge, each lethal within its context, each dependent on conditions remaining unchanged. Yet this peak carried the seeds of transition. Maximum aggression requires constant fuel. Warm temperatures must persist. Oxygen must remain available. Energy flow must stay high. As geological processes shifted slowly beneath the surface, these supports began to waver. Cooling crept in gradually, not as a sudden disruption, but as a steady constraint. Metabolic rates slowed. Recovery took longer. The cost of continuous aggression rose. What had once been effortless became expensive. Before that change fully took hold, the ocean passed through its most formidable chapter. This was not the age of the largest creatures or the strangest forms alone. It was the age when everything that made the sea dangerous operated at once, without interference. Force, speed, specialization, warmth, and abundance reinforced each other perfectly. Life did not soften under these conditions, it intensified. When cooling eventually altered the rules, it did not erase what had been built. It reduced the scale, it introduced limits, it allowed new strategies to emerge. But for a long while before that shift, the ocean existed at its most lethal expression, a place where aggression flowed smoothly through every interaction and where survival meant moving endlessly within a system that offered no pause, no mercy, and no slowing, only motion shaped by a sea that had reached the height of its own unforgiving power. After the long age when warmth, abundance, and open space aligned to push marine life toward its most aggressive expressions, the ocean began to change in quieter ways. Cooling did not arrive as a single event or sudden boundary. It unfolded gradually, spreading through currents and depths over immense spans of time. Water carried this change everywhere, touching every body it surrounded. As temperatures slipped downward, even slightly, the pace of life began to ease. Reactions slowed. Recovery took longer. Energy, once quick to flow, became something that had to be guarded. The ocean did not grow peaceful, but it grew more deliberate. Slower temperatures reshaped metabolism from the inside out. Chemical reactions that powered muscle contraction and digestion no longer rushed forward unchecked. Bodies needed more time to extract energy from food, more time to turn that energy into motion. Continuous activity became costly. Long pursuits that once ended in certainty now demanded careful judgment. Predators learned, without thought, to conserve strength rather than expend it recklessly. The sea began to favor efficiency over intensity. Movement grew measured. Encounters stretched into sequences again, allowing for hesitation where none had existed before. As metabolism slowed, size took on a different meaning. Gigantism, once a reliable shield and advantage, became harder to sustain. Large bodies required enormous energy to maintain warmth and function, and cooling waters made that energy less accessible. Growth slowed. Maximum size declined. Bodies that had once thrived through sheer mass found themselves burdened by it, struggling to meet their metabolic needs. Smaller forms, once easily overwhelmed, gained new opportunity. Agility and efficiency regained value as sheer bulk lost its edge. The ocean quietly adjusted its scale. Reduced gigantism did not eliminate large predators entirely, but it trimmed the extremes. The most colossal forms became rarer, replaced by bodies that balanced strength with manageability. Predation remained, but it adapted to narrower energy budgets. Excess became unsustainable. Traits that once pushed killing power beyond necessity now carried cost without corresponding benefit. Teeth remained sharp, but jaws grew less overbuilt. Muscles remained strong, but no longer pushed to maximal output without pause. The ocean began to prune what it could no longer afford. With these constraints came less room for excess lethality. Killing still occurred, but it became more selective. Predators could not pursue endlessly or overpower every encounter through sheer force. Decisions mattered more, though not through conscious thought. Bodies that wasted energy failed. Those that applied force only when returns were likely persisted. Violence shifted from constant pressure to targeted action. The sea did not reject aggression, it refined it. Cooling also encouraged the spread of structure and stability. Slower metabolisms supported the gradual rise of more complex habitats, reefs that grew steadily, forests that took root over time. These features broke open water into layered spaces, offering refuge and interruption. Encounters became less linear, chase paths fractured, escape regained meaning. The ocean softened not by intention, but through constraint. The same water that had once fueled relentlessness now imposed limits that reshaped behavior across generations. Food chains lengthened cautiously as energy flow slowed. With fewer rapid collapses, systems gained resilience. Multiple layers absorbed shocks that would once have rippled instantly from base to apex. This did not remove danger, but it diluted it. Dominance became harder to maintain absolutely. Competition spread across more players. Ecosystems moved away from single rulers toward shared pressure, creating spaces where different strategies could coexist. Through these changes, the ocean entered a different phase of its story. The age of unchecked aggression faded, not because life learned restraint, but because the environment demanded balance. Cooling enforced discipline. It rewarded bodies that could do enough rather than everything. Lethality remained a factor, but it no longer expanded without limit. The sea carried forward the memory of its most violent era, preserved in forms that still bore sharp edges and powerful muscles, but those edges were now set within tighter bounds. This shift did not erase what had come before. It layered over it. The ocean did not forget how to be dangerous. It learned when danger could be sustained and when it could not. Cooling waters introduced friction into a system that had once run hot and fast, forcing evolution to explore efficiency, cooperation, and subtlety alongside force. In doing so, the sea changed its rules once more, closing the chapter of excess and opening the way for complexity to rise within a world that had finally learned to slow. As cooling waters imposed limits and excess lethality receded, the ocean began a slow transformation toward stability. This change did not arrive through a single innovation, but through the quiet accumulation of structures that softened interaction and distributed pressure. Reef systems played a central role in this shift. Built patiently by countless small organisms over long spans of time, reefs rose from the seafloor as living architecture. They broke currents, scattered light, and fractured open water into pockets of shelter. For the first time, the sea offered places where movement could pause without ending in capture. These structures did not eliminate danger, but they interrupted it, turning continuous exposure into episodic risk. Life learned to persist within spaces that absorbed force rather than transmitting it directly. Reefs transformed how energy moved through the ocean. Instead of flowing rapidly upward in short, violent chains, it began to circulate through many layers. Algae, invertebrates, small fish, and larger hunters all occupied interwoven roles within a shared framework. Losses at one level no longer collapsed the entire system. When one population declined, others filled its place or shifted function, cushioning the impact. This complexity introduced resilience. Shocks that would once have erased communities now rippled outward more gently, dissipated by redundancy and diversity. The ocean started to behave less like a narrow channel and more like a braided network, capable of absorbing disturbance without breaking. Complex food webs followed naturally from this structure. As habitats multiplied, so did niches. Species evolved to specialize within smaller contexts, relying on local interactions rather than dominating wide regions. Predators still existed, but their influence became constrained by availability, competition, and habitat boundaries. No single hunter could control an entire system for long. Energy passed through many hands, many mouths, many lives before reaching the top. This lengthening of food webs reduced the intensity of any single interaction. Predation became a process woven into daily life rather than an overwhelming force that shaped everything at once. With complexity came limits on dominance that did not require extinction to enforce. Large predators encountered rivals within their own tier. Prey found refuge not just in speed or armor, but in structure and association. Schools formed, symbiotic relationships emerged. Some species relied on others for cleaning, warning, or shelter, distributing survival across connections rather than individual strength. Intelligence, which had once lagged behind force, found growing relevance here, allowing animals to navigate social and spatial complexity. The ocean began to reward awareness alongside power, timing alongside strength. Built-in limits on dominance reshaped evolution's direction. Traits that pushed aggression beyond sustainable levels now carried cost. Overspecialization reduced flexibility in a system where roles overlapped. Excessive size limited access to structured habitats. Bodies that balanced capability with efficiency thrived more reliably than those that pursued extremes. The ocean did not become gentle in an absolute sense, but it became fairer in its demands. Survival no longer required constant readiness for catastrophe. It required navigation within a living mosaic of relationships. These changes accumulated slowly, layer by layer, across millions of years. Each reef expanded the area where life could persist without constant motion. Each new connection between species added another buffer against collapse. Over time, the ocean's character shifted. Encounters became less final. Mistakes did not always end lives. Recovery became possible without complete reset. This forgiveness was not mercy, it was structure. Modern oceans carry the imprint of this long transformation. Danger still exists, but it is contextual rather than universal. Predators exert influence, but they share space with competitors, prey, and partners in systems that resist total takeover. Dominance emerges locally and temporarily rather than globally and absolutely. The sea learned, through long experiment, that stability supports diversity and diversity supports endurance. In this quieter phase of its story, the ocean did not forget its violent past. It incorporated it, setting boundaries around behaviors that once ran unchecked. The same forces that had driven lethality now operated within tighter constraints, shaping life toward coexistence rather than constant escalation. Reef systems anchored this change physically. Food webs reinforced it energetically. Limits on dominance preserved it over time. The result is an ocean that feels forgiving not because it lacks danger, but because it contains it. Life persists through connection, structure, and balance built slowly across deep time. The sea, once a proving ground of relentless pressure, became a place where many forms could endure together, held within a system that finally learned how to soften force without erasing it. As modern oceans settled into their more forgiving rhythm, the forces shaping predators narrowed into clear boundaries. The sea did not remove danger, but it enclosed it within constraints that quietly changed scale. Environmental limits emerged everywhere, not as walls, but as subtle resistances that shaped bodies over generations. Temperature gradients became more pronounced, creating regions where energy could be gained or lost quickly depending on movement. Oxygen levels stabilized at ranges that supported endurance but discouraged unchecked growth. Habitats fragmented into reefs, slopes, trenches, and open water zones, each with its own rules. Predators no longer ruled an entire oceanic expanse by default. They operated within neighborhoods defined by depth, temperature, and available prey, and these boundaries gently capped how large and how dominant they could become. Energy limits played an even stronger role. Modern food webs, rich and layered, distribute energy across many pathways rather than funneling it upward quickly. A predator today competes not only with rivals of similar size, but with entire systems designed to slow and redirect energy flow. Prey species feed on multiple sources. Mid-level predators intercept energy before it reaches the top. Losses are absorbed across layers rather than passed directly upward. This means that building and maintaining an enormous body carries constant cost. Every additional unit of size demands fuel that is harder to secure reliably. The ocean rewards efficiency more than excess. Bodies that grow just large enough to succeed, but not larger, persist more consistently than those that chase extremes. These energetic constraints reshape behavior as well as form. Modern predators hunt selectively rather than continuously. They conserve energy, choosing moments that offer the highest return. Long pursuits are rarer. Explosive effort is followed by rest. The pace of life allows recovery, but it also demands restraint. A predator that exhausts itself gains no advantage in a system where prey can vanish into structure or shift behavior in response. Aggression remains present, but it is modulated, woven into cycles of effort and recovery rather than expressed without pause. Balance has replaced chaos, not because the ocean became gentler, but because complexity demands coordination. In earlier eras, short food chains and frequent collapses created openings where dominance could surge unchecked. Today, stability limits these surges. When a predator population grows too large, prey scarcity pushes back quickly. When prey populations rise, competitors and diseases respond. Feedback loops operate constantly, keeping extremes brief. Dominance becomes temporary, local, and conditional. The ocean now resists monopolies of power through interconnected responses rather than through catastrophic reset. This balance also changes how predators are perceived. Against the backdrop of ancient giants and relentless hunters, modern predators appear smaller, quieter, and less overwhelming. Yet this impression comes from context, not weakness. A great shark or orca is still a finely tuned apex hunter, but it exists within a system that restricts how far its influence can spread. It cannot strip an ecosystem bare without consequence. It cannot expand indefinitely without resistance. Its role is powerful but contained. The ocean has learned how to hold danger without letting it dominate. Over time, this containment has favored traits that emphasize precision over scale. Sensory awareness, learning, cooperation, and timing have grown more important than sheer mass. Brains now pay for themselves in a world where encounters repeat, patterns persist, and memory matters. Social strategies allow predators to share effort and reduce risk. Intelligence extends effectiveness without demanding excessive size. The result is a shift in how lethality is expressed. It becomes quieter, more targeted, and less visible at a distance. Modern oceans still carry echoes of their violent past, preserved in deep sea zones where ancient rules linger and in forms that resemble earlier designs. But even there, energy limits apply. Pressure, darkness, and scarcity constrain growth, keeping bodies lean and specialized rather than vast. The sea maintains its lessons across scales, reinforcing moderation through physics rather than intention. This is why today's predators feel smaller, not because they lack power, but because power now operates within bounds shaped by environment, energy, and connection. The ocean does not erase danger, it distributes it. Balance replaces chaos not as a moral shift, but as an ecological one. The same forces that once pushed life toward extreme lethality now encourage sustainability, resilience, and coexistence. In this quieter arrangement, predators remain formidable, but they no longer define the entire sea. They move within it, constrained by systems that have learned how to endure, carrying forward a world where survival depends not on overwhelming force alone, but on fitting precisely into a living network that gently, constantly, and reliably pushes back. As modern oceans settled into balance and excess lethality faded into constraint, some designs endured almost unchanged, carrying the deep memory of earlier rules within their bodies. Sharks are among the most recognizable of these survivors. Their form emerged when oceans demanded efficiency above all else, and that efficiency never became obsolete. A flexible skeleton, powerful muscles, and a body shaped to move water with minimal resistance allowed them to function across eras of heat, cold, abundance, and scarcity. Their teeth, replaced continuously rather than repaired, reflect a strategy born in violent seas where damage was expected and resilience mattered more than perfection. Sharks did not need to reinvent themselves as conditions shifted. Their design already balanced power, efficiency, and adaptability in a way that fit both ancient chaos and modern restraint. Crocodilians tell a similar story, though their path bridges water and land. Their ancestors lived through oceans that rewarded ambush, patience, and overwhelming force delivered in a single moment. That strategy remained viable even as environments changed. A crocodilian body wastes little energy. It can wait for long periods without feeding, conserving strength in a way ancient, relentless predators could not. When action comes, it is decisive, built around jaws that still echo a time when crushing power solved problems quickly. This ability to shift between stillness and sudden violence allowed crocodilians to pass through extinctions that erased more specialized forms. They carry forward an ancient solution refined by constraint rather than excess, one that remains effective in rivers, coasts, and estuaries shaped by modern balance. Deep sea ambush predators preserve perhaps the clearest image of the ocean's past. In the depths, where light fades and energy moves slowly, ancient rules linger. Pressure, darkness, and cold limit growth, but they also protect simplicity. Predators here rely on surprise rather than pursuit, using stillness, camouflage, and sudden motion to secure rare meals. Their bodies often appear strange by surface standards: elongated jaws, expandable mouths, sensitive organs tuned to faint signals. These traits descend directly from early solutions shaped in open water, where encounters were unpredictable and decisive action mattered. In the deep, where the environment itself enforces restraint, such designs remain effective without modification. What unites these survivors is not size or aggression alone, but balance achieved early and never exceeded. Each of these designs solves the same fundamental problems efficiently across changing conditions. They do not depend on warm water to fuel constant motion. They do not require dense prey populations to sustain endless pursuit. They function within energy limits rather than against them. This is why they endured while more extreme forms vanished. Their bodies were never built solely for peak lethality. They were built for persistence. These ancient designs also reveal something important about evolution's direction. Progress does not always mean complexity or novelty. Sometimes it means arriving early at a solution that fits physics so well it never needs replacement. Sharks, crocodilians, and deep sea ambush predators occupy niches where ancient constraints still apply, where efficiency, patience, and decisive action remain rewarded. They act as living bridges between eras, carrying forward the imprint of seas that were once far more dangerous. Their survival shapes modern oceans quietly. Sharks regulate food webs through presence rather than domination. Crocodilians anchor ecosystems at the edge of land and water, connecting realms shaped by different pressures. Deep sea predators maintain order in environments where scarcity rules. None of these forms overwhelms its world completely. Each operates within limits shaped by temperature, energy, and structure, showing how ancient designs can persist when aligned perfectly with their environment. In this way, the ocean retains fragments of its earlier selves, not as fossils alone, but as living bodies that still move, hunt, and endure. These creatures do not feel out of place because they are not relics. They are reminders that evolution does not discard what continues to work. Long after the peak of marine lethality passed, after cooling changed the rules and balance replaced chaos, some designs proved timeless. They slipped through history with only minor adjustments, carrying the deep calm of solutions that never needed to shout, only to last. Through them, the ancient oceans remain present, not as violence unleashed, but as form preserved. In their movements and stillness, in their patience and sudden action, the long story of Earth's most dangerous waters continues softly, woven into modern seas that learn to forgive without forgetting where they came from. Far below the reach of sunlight, beyond reefs and surface currents, the deep ocean holds a different tempo, one that feels almost detached from the world above. Here, darkness settles permanently, not as an absence but as a condition that shapes everything within it. In this dim realm, ancient rules persist because little has demanded their replacement. The deep sea does not rush life forward, it slows it down, allowing strategies forged during the most dangerous eras of ocean history to endure with minimal alteration. What once governed vast stretches of open water now survives in pockets of shadow, preserved not through intention, but through stability born of isolation. Darkness plays a central role in this preservation. Without light, vision loses its dominance, and with it many of the pressures that reshaped surface life. Detection becomes rare and imprecise. Encounters arrive slowly, often announced only by faint vibrations or subtle chemical traces drifting through still water. In such conditions, speed offers limited advantage. Chase holds little meaning when prey may not be seen until it is nearly within reach. This restores value to patience, stillness, and ambush, strategies that once thrived in early oceans before complex habitats fractured open water into safer spaces. The deep sea does not reward constant motion, it rewards waiting. Energy scarcity reinforces this pace. Food arrives infrequently, falling from above or drifting sideways from distant productivity. Each meal matters, and wasting effort carries heavy cost. Bodies adapt by conserving energy rather than expending it freely. Muscles rest for long stretches. Metabolism runs slowly, ticking forward like a distant clock rather than racing like it once did in warm, shallow seas. Growth takes years rather than months. Reproduction unfolds cautiously. In this environment, change itself slows, and with it, evolution eases into long stretches of continuity. Because encounters are rare and resources precious, violence takes on a different character. It remains present, but urgency fades. Predators do not pursue endlessly. They position themselves where prey might pass and wait, sometimes for days, sometimes for longer. When action comes, it is sudden and decisive, but it is followed by long stillness once again. This mirrors ancient patterns from a time when open water offered few refuges and survival depended on catching opportunity whenever it appeared. In the deep, those patterns remain effective, not because they are aggressive, but because they are efficient. Slow evolution preserves these designs with remarkable fidelity. Without frequent environmental disruption, there is little pressure to innovate rapidly. Extinctions still occur, but less often and with narrower reach. Temperature remains stable. Chemistry changes gradually. As a result, forms that work continue to work, generation after generation. Some deep sea creatures resemble fossils come to life, carrying shapes and behaviors that echo conditions long vanished from surface waters. Their existence reminds us that evolution does not always march forward toward complexity. Sometimes it pauses, maintaining solutions that fit their context perfectly. Violence without urgency defines this world. Threats exist, but they do not stack endlessly atop one another. There is time between danger. Bodies recover fully before the next encounter. This spacing alters experience without altering outcome. Death still comes swiftly when it arrives, but it arrives less often. The deep ocean does not soften violence by removing it. It softens it by diluting its frequency. Survival depends not on constant readiness, but on enduring long intervals of quiet punctuated by rare critical moments. In this way, the deep sea functions as a living archive. It preserves rules that once shaped the entire ocean but now apply only here. Ambush over pursuit, efficiency over excess, patience over dominance. These strategies feel ancient because they are. They belong to a time when life first learned how to survive uncertainty without shelter, when movement itself carried risk, and when success depended on acting decisively when opportunity finally appeared. The surface ocean moved on, layered with reefs, complexity, and feedback loops that transformed interaction and slowed escalation. The deep remained behind, not frozen, but steady. Its creatures did not need to change because the environment did not ask them to. In darkness, without clocks set by day or season, time itself stretches. Evolution follows that stretch, drifting slowly, preserving rather than reinventing. When we look into the deep, we are not seeing a harsher world than the one above. We are seeing an older one, a place where ancient strategies still make sense, where life continues to operate under rules written long before balance softened the seas. The deep ocean stands as a museum not built of stone or glass, but of water and time, holding living exhibits shaped by eras of danger and preserved by stillness, reminding us that Earth never fully discards its past. It tucks it away into shadow, where it continues quietly, patient and unchanged, beneath the shifting surface of the modern world. As modern oceans became more forgiving and danger learned to hide within structure rather than dominate every interaction, something subtle lingered within us. Long before humans existed, before mammals walked confidently on land, life spent immense spans of time shaped by water that did not offer safety easily. Those histories did not vanish when our ancestors left the sea. They were carried forward quietly, embedded not as memories we can recall, but as patterns that still influence how our bodies react. Evolutionary memory does not function like a story passed down in words. It exists as instinctive responses shaped by survival pressures repeated so often that they became default. Deep water represents a place where those ancient pressures once ruled without restraint. The discomfort many people feel near dark. Open water is not learned through experience alone. It arises from inherited responses to environments where visibility was limited, escape uncertain, and danger could arrive without warning. The body reacts before the mind can explain why. Limited visibility plays a powerful role in this unease. Humans rely heavily on sight to understand and control our surroundings. We feel safest where boundaries are clear, where movement can be tracked, and where threats can be anticipated. Deep water removes these comforts almost immediately. Light fades quickly. Depth conceals distance. The seafloor disappears, and with it, any sense of scale or grounding. This mirrors conditions that once defined the most dangerous periods of ocean history, when open water meant exposure and darkness preserved older rules of survival. In such environments, the inability to see does not simply reduce information, it removes control. The brain, shaped by millions of years of responding to visible cues, interprets this absence as risk. Even when no danger is present, the body reacts as if something unseen could be approaching, because for most of life's history, that assumption was correct. Ancestral danger cues still operate beneath conscious thought. Sudden changes in depth, shifts in water temperature, the sensation of being suspended without reference points, all trigger responses associated with vulnerability. These cues once signaled environments where ambush predators thrived and where mistakes carried final consequences. In deep or dark water, sound behaves differently. Movement feels slower yet heavier, and the senses struggle to establish orientation. This sensory mismatch unsettles the nervous system, which evolved to detect patterns quickly and act decisively. When patterns dissolve, uncertainty rises, and uncertainty has long been linked with threat. The body responds with heightened awareness, tension, and caution, even when logic insists there is no immediate danger. This reaction is not fear in a simple sense, it is preparedness, a tuning of attention toward the possibility of harm. For early life, such tuning meant survival. In deep water, where violence occurred without urgency, but with certainty, stillness and awareness mattered. Humans carry traces of that logic. Our discomfort encourages caution near environments where our bodies lack the adaptations needed to thrive. We cannot breathe there. We cannot move efficiently. We cannot sense danger clearly. These limitations echo the vulnerabilities of small, unarmored organisms in ancient seas, exposed and dependent on quick responses to survive. Cultural stories, myths, and symbols have reinforced this unease, but they did not create it. Tales of depths hiding unknown creatures resonate because they align with instincts already present. The imagination fills darkness with possibility because evolution trained it to consider unseen threats seriously. Even modern experiences, standing at the edge of deep water or floating above an unseen drop, activate responses far older than language. The calm surface offers no reassurance when the mind knows how little it can perceive beneath. At the same time, this unease exists alongside fascination. Humans are drawn to deep water precisely because it represents something beyond daily experience. It is one of the few environments on Earth that still feels largely unconquered, governed by rules different from those on land. This blend of attraction and discomfort mirrors life's long relationship with the sea. The ocean was both birthplace and battleground, provider and threat. We carry both responses within us. The deep ocean remains a place where ancient rules persist, and our bodies seem to recognize this even when our lives are far removed from those conditions. The feeling is not a flaw in human psychology. It is an inheritance, a quiet reminder written into our nervous system by a world where survival depended on respecting environments that could not be negotiated or controlled. When humans feel uneasy about deep water, they are responding not just to the present moment, but to a long continuum of life that learned, again and again, that darkness and depth demand humility. In that response, the ocean's ancient story continues softly, not as fear, but as awareness carried forward across time. For most of Earth's history, land offered refuge compared to the oceans. It was quieter, less crowded, and slower to respond with sudden force. Predation arrived later on land, and for a long time it unfolded at a gentler pace, shaped by gravity, limited speed, and seasonal rhythms. But eventually, a transformation began that reversed this ancient balance. Danger did not increase on land because animals grew larger or faster than those in the sea. It increased because a single lineage learned to change the rules themselves. Fire, tools, and intelligence altered selection pressure in ways no environment ever had before, turning land into a place where survival depended not only on biology, but on adaptation to a thinking threat. The use of fire marked a profound shift. Fire extended activity into darkness, removed the safety of night, and transformed landscapes rapidly. It altered vegetation, displaced animals, and created barriers and traps where none had existed. Fire did not simply kill. It reshaped habitats wholesale, pushing species into unfamiliar territory or cutting them off from resources they had relied on for generations. For animals that had evolved to respond to slow environmental change, this speed was unprecedented. Fire introduced instability without warning, not through climate or chemistry, but through intent. Tools extended this pressure further. With tools, strength no longer depended on muscle alone. Distance ceased to offer protection. Speed became less reliable. Armor lost value against sharp edges and projectiles. Animals that had survived predators for millions of years found themselves vulnerable to forces their bodies had never been shaped to resist. Tools allowed precision without proximity, turning open landscapes into fields of invisible risk. Selection pressure shifted away from natural encounters toward encounters defined by planning and preparation. Survival strategies built for other predators faltered under this new logic. Intelligence bound these changes together. Unlike earlier predators, humans did not rely on a single method. They adapted behaviors quickly, shared knowledge, and refined techniques across generations. This introduced cumulative pressure, where each success made the next one more efficient. Animals did not face a static threat. They faced a moving one, capable of learning, coordinating, and anticipating responses. Escape routes that worked once failed the next time. Patterns that had ensured survival were dismantled deliberately. The land grew unpredictable in a way even ancient seas had not been. As humans spread, they reshaped selection pressure across entire ecosystems. Large predators declined first, not because they were the most dangerous, but because they competed for similar resources and posed direct threat. Large herbivores followed, pressured by hunting that outpaced reproduction. Smaller species adapted in mixed ways, some thriving alongside humans, others retreating or disappearing. The landscape itself changed as forests were cleared, grasslands expanded, and waterways redirected. Evolution, once guided primarily by environment, now responded increasingly to human behavior. This marked a complete reversal. The ocean, once the most dangerous place on Earth, became relatively stable in comparison. Its limits were physical and predictable. Land, by contrast, became a space where danger could think, plan, and alter conditions rapidly. Animals on land faced extinction not through slow competition, but through sudden displacement and overwhelming efficiency. The rules of survival changed from endurance and adaptation to avoidance and coexistence. Those species that persisted did so by becoming smaller, faster to reproduce, or capable of living near humans without attracting conflict. This reversal did not occur overnight. It unfolded gradually as human populations expanded and technology accumulated. But once it took hold, it reshaped the trajectory of life. The apex predator role shifted entirely. Dominance no longer required size, strength, or specialized anatomy. It required the ability to manipulate environment and information. In this new world, danger came not from claws or teeth, but from intention guided by understanding. Yet, even as land grew more dangerous, the ocean remained largely governed by older rules. Humans entered the sea later, and with more limitation, marine life still operates under constraints shaped by physics and energy rather than planning. This contrast sharpens the reversal. The place that once demanded constant vigilance became comparatively forgiving, while the place that once offered refuge became the center of existential risk. This chapter of Earth's story reflects not a triumph of intelligence alone, but a transformation of responsibility. When land became more dangerous than sea, it was because a species gained the power to reshape selection pressure deliberately. Life on Earth entered an era where survival depended on navigating not only natural forces, but choices. The ancient oceans taught life how to endure danger shaped by environment. Land, through humanity, introduced danger shaped by mind. In that shift, the balance of the planet turned, quietly but completely, marking the end of an age where the sea alone defined what it meant to survive. As land took on a new kind of danger shaped by intention and choice, the oceans continued their slow, physical rhythms, governed by temperature, chemistry, and circulation. For a long while, those rhythms kept the sea within bounds that favored balance and recovery. Yet the forces that once drove marine lethality have not vanished. They remain embedded in physics and biology, waiting for conditions to align. Warming waters act as one such alignment. When the ocean absorbs heat, its behavior shifts quietly but decisively. Metabolism accelerates. Chemical reactions proceed more readily. Growth quickens where food allows. Predators recover faster between efforts, and prey burn energy at a pace that demands constant intake. These changes alone do not create danger, but they loosen the constraints that once softened interactions. The sea begins to move faster again, returning to a tempo that earlier ages knew well. Warming also rearranges life's distribution. Species migrate toward cooler refuges, compressing ecosystems into narrower bands. Encounters increase simply because bodies share less space. Where cold once slowed pursuit, warmth reduces resistance. In such conditions, competition sharpens. Traits that favor decisive action regain value. The ocean does not need to become chaotic to feel harsher. It only needs to reduce margins. When energy budgets tighten and demands rise, survival strategies gravitate toward efficiency and force, echoing ancient patterns shaped by heat. Alongside warming comes oxygen loss, a quieter but equally powerful shift. Warmer water holds less oxygen, and stratified layers limit mixing between surface and depth. Regions grow hypoxic, thinning the breath available to life. This does not eliminate predators, but it alters which ones thrive. Animals capable of tolerating low oxygen gain advantage. Others weaken. Food webs compress as sensitive species vanish, shortening the path between prey and predator once more. In these conditions, the ocean begins to resemble its earlier, simpler states, where energy moved quickly and losses traveled upward without delay. Oxygen loss also concentrates stress. Prey species struggle to maintain growth and reproduction. Predators that can endure scarcity exert greater pressure simply by persisting. Encounters become more final because recovery grows uncertain. The sea does not need to be full of giant hunters to become dangerous. It only needs systems to lose their buffering layers. When oxygen declines, those layers thin, and the old rules of exposure and urgency begin to return. Historical parallels offer context for these shifts. In Earth's past, warming combined with oxygen instability often preceded upheaval. Seas that heated rapidly supported bursts of productivity followed by collapse. Food chains shortened, dominance surged briefly, then vanished through extinction. These were not anomalies, but repeated responses to the same pressures now building again. The planet remembers how oceans behave under stress because it has done so many times before. Each episode followed a familiar arc: acceleration, compression, instability, reset. Yet there are differences as well. Modern oceans carry complexity built across millions of years. Reef systems, long food webs, and global circulation patterns still provide resilience. Intelligence and technology, though altering land most strongly, influence the sea too through fishing, pollution, and climate change. These added layers complicate outcomes. They can buffer, change, or amplify it, depending on how they interact. The future ocean will not be a simple return to an ancient state. It will be a hybrid, shaped by old physics and new pressures layered together. What remains constant is the direction of response. When warmth rises and oxygen falls, the ocean trends towards speed and decisiveness. It reduces room for error. It favors bodies and behaviors that act efficiently under stress. Violence, in this sense, is not aggression alone, it is the narrowing of choice. As conditions tighten, survival depends on fewer viable paths, and those paths resemble the ones carved long ago in far harsher seas. This does not mean the oceans are destined to become deadly in the same way again, but it does mean the ingredients that once produced extreme marine lethality are not abstract. They are physical, measurable, and active. The sea does not invent new rules under pressure. It revisits familiar ones. Warming and oxygen loss push it toward those old boundaries where balance thins and outcomes sharpen. Understanding this continuity changes how we read the present. The ocean's future is not an unknown story. It is an old story unfolding under new circumstances. The same forces that once forged predators of remarkable efficiency and ecosystems of constant risk still operate beneath the surface. Whether the sea crosses that threshold again depends not only on climate and chemistry, but on how much room remains for stability to hold. The ancient oceans show us what happens when that room disappears, not as prophecy, but as memory carried forward in water that has never forgotten how to become unforgiving. Looking back across the long memory of the oceans, a quiet pattern emerges, one that carries more weight than any single creature ever could. The most dangerous eras were not defined by monsters alone, but by instability. When prehistoric seas became lethal, it was not because life suddenly turned violent by choice. It was because the environment removed limits. Warmth accelerated bodies. Oxygen shifts thinned margins. Open water erased refuge. Short food chains passed stress upward without pause. In those conditions, aggression flourished not as a strategy, but as a consequence. The sea did not decide to become deadly. It became permissive of danger, and life followed where physics led. This perspective changes how we interpret prehistoric predators. Massive jaws, bladed teeth, and crushing bodies were symptoms rather than causes. They arose because the environment allowed, and often rewarded, extreme solutions. When stability broke down, when chemistry fluctuated, and habitats offered no shelter, survival demanded decisiveness. Violence was not excess, it was efficiency under pressure. In calmer eras, the same traits lost value, not because they were flawed, but because they became unnecessary and costly. The warning here is subtle. It is not that powerful predators are the greatest threat to ecosystems. It is that unstable conditions create space for extremes to dominate. Stability acts as a moderator. When temperature, oxygen, and structure remain within narrow bounds, ecosystems absorb shocks and distribute pressure. Food webs lengthen, diversity increases. No single lineage can expand unchecked for long. Predation becomes part of a cycle rather than its driving force. Prehistoric seas show us that when this balance holds, even formidable hunters fit within the system without overwhelming it. Danger exists, but it is contained, diluted by complexity and connection. When stability fails, aggression rises naturally. Environment shapes behavior long before intention or intelligence enters the picture. In the ancient ocean, life did not weigh moral outcomes. It responded to gradients of energy and opportunity. Faster metabolism encouraged constant activity. Scarcity forced competition. Open space removed hiding places. Under these conditions, violence solved problems quickly, and quick solutions persisted. Aggression followed the path of least resistance carved by physical laws, not by choice. Violence, in this sense, follows physics. It flows where energy flows. It intensifies where constraints weaken. It recedes when limits return. Prehistoric seas demonstrate this repeatedly across time. Each cycle of lethality coincided with environmental permissiveness, and each retreat into calmer interaction followed the return of boundaries. Cooling waters, structured habitats, and stable chemistry did more to soften the ocean than any evolutionary innovation alone. Monsters disappeared not because they were defeated, but because the world no longer supported them. This warning extends beyond the past. It suggests that managing ecosystems is less about controlling individual species and more about maintaining the conditions that regulate interaction. Remove the stabilizers, and systems accelerate toward extremes. Preserve them, and even powerful forces remain in balance. The ancient ocean reminds us that danger is not an inherent property of life, but an emergent property of context. There is also humility in this lesson. Humans often focus on visible threats, dramatic creatures, sudden events. Prehistoric seas teach that the deeper drivers of change operate quietly. Temperature shifts by small amounts. Oxygen levels drift. Habitat complexity erodes. None of these announce themselves loudly, yet together they reshape entire worlds. By the time violence peaks, the conditions that produced it have been in place for long stretches, unnoticed until their effects become impossible to ignore. The calm, modern ocean, with its layered food webs and built-in limits, is not a default state. It is an achievement of stability maintained across millions of years. The prehistoric record shows how easily that state can unravel when foundational conditions change. Monsters come and go, but the forces that allow them to rise are persistent and repeatable. In this way, ancient seas offer not a prophecy, but a reminder. Life responds faithfully to its environment. Aggression intensifies where instability allows it. Violence does not require malice. It requires permission. The deepest warning carried forward from those long vanished waters is simple and profound. If stability holds, ecosystems regulate themselves. If it fails, extremes return. The ocean has already shown us both outcomes, written clearly in its past, waiting quietly for those who learn how to read it. Long after the oceans shed their most violent expressions, their legacy remains woven into how we understand life itself. Ancient seas continue to fascinate us, not because they were filled with spectacular creatures alone, but because they reveal how deeply environment shapes possibility. In those distant waters, life tested limits that modern oceans rarely allow. Bodies grew larger, faster, and more heavily armed, not out of excess, but out of alignment with conditions that removed restraint. When we study these eras, we are drawn to the clarity of cause and effect. Change the temperature, the oxygen, the structure of space, and life responds with predictable intensity. The fascination comes from recognizing that biology is not separate from physics, but a reflection of it, molded patiently over time. These ancient oceans also unsettle us, even when viewed from the safety of knowledge and distance. They unsettle because they expose how thin the boundary is between balance and extremity. The shift from a forgiving sea to a lethal one did not require intelligence, intention, or malice. It required only a set of conditions drifting slightly beyond their usual bounds. Warmth increased pace. Instability removed buffers. Open water erased refuge. The result was a world where survival demanded speed and force above all else. This realization challenges comforting ideas about progress and safety. It reminds us that calm systems are not guaranteed. They are maintained by constraints that can weaken quietly, long before their effects become visible. The discomfort these eras evoke also stems from recognition. We see patterns that feel uncomfortably familiar: compression of habitats, acceleration of metabolism, loss of complexity. These were not rare anomalies, they were repeated responses to recurring pressures. The ancient ocean does not feel alien because it obeyed strange rules. It feels unsettling because it obeyed the same rules that still govern the planet. Physics did not change. Chemistry did not change. Only conditions shifted. That continuity makes the past feel close, and closeness brings unease. The extremes produced during Earth's most dangerous era reflect what happens when limits fall away. Evolution does not aim for moderation by default. It explores whatever pathways are available. When energy flows freely and barriers vanish, extremes flourish, size increases, weapons sharpen, behaviors narrow toward efficiency under pressure. These forms were not mistakes. They were optimal solutions within their context. The reason they disappeared is not failure, but context change. When the environment no longer supported such intensity, those solutions lost relevance, and life moved on. This insight reshapes how we think about extinction and legacy. The ancient oceans were not erased, they were transformed. Their lessons remain active, encoded in living designs that still move through modern seas and in deep waters where old rules persist. Sharks, crocodilians, ambush predators, all carry fragments of that era forward, quiet reminders that some solutions transcend time when they align perfectly with underlying forces. The ocean did not discard its past, it integrated it, layering new complexity on top of ancient foundations. We are also drawn to these eras because they reveal a form of honesty in nature. There is no disguise, no narrative of gradual improvement. There is only response. When stability holds, diversity spreads. When stability breaks, dominance concentrates. Violence follows physics, not intention. Understanding this strips away myth and leaves clarity. The ancient sea did not punish or reward, it allowed. Life filled what was allowed. The quiet legacy of Earth's most dangerous era lies in this clarity. It teaches that monsters are not the root of danger, conditions are. It teaches that balance is powerful precisely because it prevents extremes, not because it eliminates conflict. It teaches that resilience is built not by strength alone, but by structure, redundancy, and limits that distribute pressure. These lessons apply far beyond the ocean, touching every ecosystem shaped by the same forces. Even now, when the surface of the sea appears calm, the memory of those ancient waters persists. It persists in the deep, where time moves slowly and old strategies endure. It persists in human unease, in fascination tinged with discomfort. It persists in science, guiding how we interpret change and risk. The ancient ocean does not haunt us through spectacle. It speaks quietly, through patterns repeated across time. In listening to that quiet legacy, we gain perspective. We see that Earth's most dangerous era was not an aberration, but a phase shaped by conditions that can return. We see that stability is not a given, but a balance continuously maintained. And we see that extremes arise naturally when that balance loosens. The prehistoric seas still matter because they reveal what the world becomes when limits fall away, and because they remind us that the line between calm and chaos has always been thinner than it appears. When we trace the ocean's story from its beginnings to the present, a single truth runs quietly beneath every chapter. The seas were life's birthplace, and they were also its first battleground. From the moment living chemistry learned to persist, water became the stage where survival was tested most intensely. Before forests, before skies filled with wings, before land learned how to threaten what walked upon it, the ocean shaped life through pressure, instability, and relentless consequence. Danger was not an anomaly in that world. It was a condition woven into temperature, oxygen, space, and energy. Life did not stumble into violence by accident. It responded to the environment it was given, again and again, across spans of time so long they resisted intuition. Seen this way, the deadliest eras of the sea feel less like dark chapters and more like honest ones. They show us what happens when limits loosen, when warmth accelerates bodies, when oxygen fluctuates, when refuge disappears and food chains shorten. In those moments, aggression rises because it works. Extremes appear because the environment permits them. The ocean did not choose monsters, it allowed them. And when conditions shifted, when cooling returned, when structure and complexity spread, those same extremes faded without drama. Life adjusted, not because it learned restraint, but because restraint became efficient again. This is why danger in the ocean was never random. It followed physics, it followed chemistry, it followed energy. The most lethal periods emerged when the sea itself encouraged speed, size, and decisiveness. The calmer periods arrived when boundaries returned and systems gained the ability to absorb shock. Stability mattered more than any predator, then and now. When stability held, even the most formidable hunters fit into balance. When it failed, balance vanished quickly, and life moved toward intensity without hesitation. That lesson echoes beyond deep time. It shapes how we understand the present and how we imagine the future. The ocean still responds to the same forces. Warming, oxygen loss, habitat change, these are not abstract ideas, but familiar triggers with long histories. The past does not warn us through spectacle alone, it warns us through pattern. The sea has already shown what it becomes when environmental limits weaken, and it has shown how slowly, quietly, and consistently those changes unfold before their consequences become obvious. And yet, there is comfort in this story as well. The ocean learned how to soften itself. It built reefs. It layered food webs. It developed limits that made space for diversity and endurance. Modern seas carry that achievement forward, holding danger within systems that resist collapse. Even in their depths, where ancient rules still linger, the ocean balances efficiency with patience, violence with restraint, shaped by scarcity rather than chaos. Life continues, adjusted but persistent, shaped by a world that learned, over immense spans, how to regulate its own intensity. As this long journey comes to rest, it helps to pause and reflect on which moments in the ocean's history felt most hostile to you. Some eras impress through size and speed, others through instability and uncertainty. Each reveals a different face of danger shaped by environment rather than intent. Sharing those reflections is part of how we keep these deep time stories alive, not as distant facts, but as lived understanding carried forward. If these quiet explorations of Earth's past bring you calm, curiosity, or a sense of connection to the long story beneath your feet and beyond the shore, you are warmly invited to stay. Subscribing helps this gentle corner of science continue to grow, and it allows more of these slow journeys through deep time to find their way to others who enjoy drifting through history at an unhurried pace. For now, let the noise of the world soften. The oceans have told their story, not in waves or roars, but in patterns that unfold patiently across time. Life rose from water, learned how to survive its most dangerous moods, and carried those lessons forward into calmer eras. And as we step back into the present, that long memory remains beneath the surface, steady and quiet, reminding us that even the most hostile worlds can give rise to balance if the conditions allow it to endure.